In December of 2017, a woman in her early 70s walked into a private lunch inside Buckingham Palace, wearing a piece of jewelry that would be photographed, magnified, and argued over within the hour. The jewelry was a brooch. It showed the head and shoulders of a black African man, carved and enameled, wrapped in a gold turban and a coat of dark stone. Jewelers have a name for the style. They call it blackamoor. The occasion was the Queen's Christmas lunch for the wider royal family, and among the guests that day was Meghan Markle, recently engaged to Prince Harry, and attending one of her first gatherings inside the family she was about to join. The woman wearing the brooch was Princess Michael of Kent. By the time the cars pulled away from the forecourt, the image had travelled around the world, and the apology followed almost as fast. Her office said she was sorry and distressed. The brooch had been a gift. She had worn it before without a second thought, and she would never wear it again. Most of that was probably true. None of it closed the story. The story held because there was nothing new in it. For something close to 40 years by that afternoon, Princess Michael had been the member of the British royal family most likely to turn up in the wrong headline. She was not the most senior figure in any room she entered. What she had, year after year, was a gift for trouble that none of the others could match. The brooch belonged to a much longer record, one that ran all the way back to the summer she married into the House of Windsor, and it was read the way every earlier chapter had been read, as more evidence for a reputation she had spent decades failing to shed. That reputation came with a short and ugly summary. Around the palace, in the newspapers, and later in the memoirs of people who had worked close to the family, she was described in language that was seldom kind, and now and then plainly cruel. A grand woman, a difficult one. In the oldest and harshest version, a nasty piece of work. People said it, and they said it often. What gives the phrase its weight is that the machinery around her appears to have agreed with a fair amount of it, and to have known most of it for years, from the private secretaries and the household staff to the senior royals who set the temperature for everyone beneath them. So this is the story of a woman. It is also the story of the family she married into, and of the long, careful distance that family kept between what it understood in private and what it was ever willing to say out loud. Before we go any further, one small thing. If stories like this one are how you like to spend an evening, take a second to subscribe and press the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of slow history reach the people who will actually sit through the whole of it. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, because the answer is always broader and stranger than anyone would guess. Then stay with me. To understand how a baroness from the middle of Europe ended up the most talked about person at a British royal lunch, we have to go back to the year she was born, in a country that was only weeks from ceasing to exist. She was born Marie Christine Anna Agnes Hedwig Ida von Reibnitz on the 15th of January 1945 in the spa town of Carlsbad, known now by its Czech name of Karlovy Vary. The place matters as much as the date. That winter, the town sat inside Hitler's Reich, in a border region that had been sliced away from Czechoslovakia a few years before and handed to Germany. She arrived in the final months of the Second World War, in a corner of Europe that within 2 years would be emptied of almost its entire German-speaking population. Before her second birthday, the family she had been born into had lost the ground beneath it. Her father was Baron Gunther Hubertus von Reibnitz, from an old Silesian noble family. Her mother was Countess Marianne Shapari, from an old Hungarian one. It was, on paper, a fine match of two aristocratic houses. In practice, it was a marriage running out of time, in a world that was about to disappear. The union did not survive the upheaval, and it ended soon after the war. Her mother would build a new life a long way from the ruins of Central Europe, and Marie Christine's childhood would be split across countries and continents, carrying a long chain of noble names and almost none of the money those names were once meant to guarantee. The names would follow her for the rest of her life. So would the shadow behind one of them. In 1985, 7 years after she had married Prince Michael, a British newspaper investigation reported that her father had belonged to the SS, the most feared organization in the Nazi state. For a woman who had by then spent years being received at Buckingham Palace and at Windsor, presented as a princess of the British royal house, it was a public blow of a very particular kind. She said she had not known. She said the discovery had stunned her as much as anyone, that her father had died when she was young, and that she had grown up knowing almost nothing of his war. Historians and biographers went over the documents afterward, and the picture that came back was more tangled than a single grim word. A man who had joined the party, and who had also, at points, fallen foul of it. However that history finally settles, the effect on his daughter was fixed the instant the story ran. From then on she was the royal with the SS father, and no apology and no correction could unwrite the line. That experience sits underneath everything that came later. By the time that story broke, she had already made the leap that changed her name and her life. In the middle of the 1970s she was living in London, working, moving in fashionable company, and married to an English banker named Thomas Trowbridge. That first marriage struggled and ended in separation, and it would later be annulled by the Roman Catholic Church, a detail that would matter enormously for what came next. What came next was Prince Michael of Kent. He was a grandson of King George V, a first cousin of the Queen, and one of the quieter men in the family, an army officer with a long beard that made strangers look twice, because he carried an uncanny resemblance to the last Tsar of Russia. The likeness was not built on nothing. Through his family's continental marriages, he carried Russian imperial blood, and Russia would run like a thread through his whole life. When he and Marie Christine decided to marry, the couple walked straight into the oldest rule in the British royal book. The rule was religion. Under the Act of Settlement, passed in 1701, any member of the royal family who married a Roman Catholic gave up their place in the line of succession. Marie Christine was a Catholic. Prince Michael, by marrying her, surrendered his own claim to the throne, a claim so far down the order that it was never going to be tested, but a claim all the same. There was a second condition too, pressed by the church and the family alike. The couple agreed that any children would be raised in the Church of England. She kept her faith. Her children would not follow it. That was the price of the ring, and she paid it before the wedding had even taken place. They married in the summer of 1978, in a civil ceremony at the town hall in Vienna, because Rome would not at first grant the religious blessing they wanted. A Roman Catholic divorcee marrying into the Protestant British royal family, in a foreign city, under an unresolved question about her annulment, was not the fairy tale the palace liked to sell. From the very first day, she was the wrong kind of story, and the household noticed. She arrived tall, striking, fluent in several languages, with expensive taste and a manner that read to some as regal and to others as pushy. It did not take long for the second reading to win. The British press handed her a nickname that stuck harder than any title the Queen could grant. They called her Princess Pushy. The name was snobbish and it was cruel, and it also captured something the establishment had already decided to believe about her, that she was an outsider who had married up and behaved as though she had been born to it. She never escaped the label. Decades later, it was still the first thing many people knew about her, printed and reprinted until it read like a job description. If the nickname had stood alone, it might have faded. It did not stand alone, because across the years that followed, she supplied the newspapers with a steady stream of material, and each new episode was dropped straight into the frame the nickname had built. There was the money. The Kents were not wealthy in the way the public imagines all royals to be wealthy. Prince Michael carried out royal duties for years without drawing an income from public funds, earning his living instead through business, and the couple's finances were a recurring subject of comment. The sharpest of it settled on their home. For many years they lived in a large apartment inside Kensington Palace, a grace and favour residence, meaning it was granted by the Crown, rather than bought or rented, at anything like a market price. When the terms became public, and in particular, the very low rent the couple were reported to pay while occupying a substantial palace apartment, it grew into a small scandal all its own. Critics asked why minor royals who undertook limited public work should be housed so cheaply in one of the most valuable postcodes in London. The arrangement was later changed, and the couple were reported to have moved to a commercial rent. The damage to the image, once again, outlasted the correction. Then came the books. Princess Michael built a real second career as an author of popular history, and later of historical fiction, writing about the royalty of Europe and the women who lived at the edges of its great courts. By the accounts of people in publishing, she was a serious and hard-working writer who did her own research and sold in genuine numbers. But her writing life brought its own trouble. One of her early history books drew public accusations that certain passages sat too close to the earlier work of other authors, the sort of charge that trails many popular historians, and one she firmly disputed. For a woman already cast as someone who took what was not hers, the accusation landed on ground that had been well prepared. The most damaging episode of all came from New York. In 2004, it was reported that during a dinner at a Manhattan restaurant, Princess Michael had reacted to a group of black diners at a nearby table by telling them, in effect, to go back to the colonies. The words put in her mouth were incendiary, and they spread within hours. She denied saying anything of the kind. Her own account of the exchange was different, and she insisted the reported quote was simply false. What is beyond dispute is that the allegation attached itself to her name and never fully came away, because it fit. It fit the picture of the grand, imperious outsider the public had been handed years earlier, and a denial, however firm, was never going to travel as far as the original charge. And then, 13 years later, there was the brooch, the scene this story opened on. By December of 2017, the pattern was so well set that the incident barely needed explaining. A woman with a reputation for racial insensitivity, real or assigned, had worn an image many found offensive to a lunch at which the family's first mixed heritage member was a guest. Whether it was a genuine act of hostility, a spectacular failure of judgment, or simply an older woman reaching without thought for a favorite piece of jewelry, the public had long since made up its mind which reading to believe. The reputation chose the reading. It always had. It would be easy, hearing that list, to conclude that all the trouble in the marriage lived on her side. It did not. Prince Michael carried a public embarrassment of his own, and a serious one. His lifelong link to Russia, rooted in that imperial ancestry and built up over years of business in the country, became a liability in 2021. An undercover investigation, run jointly by a British television program and a Sunday newspaper, filmed the prince and a business associate apparently offering to use his royal standing and his access in Russia on behalf of what he believed to be a South Korean gold company. The company was an invention of the reporters. On camera, his associate spoke of the prince in terms that suggested his name and his connections could be had for the right arrangement. The prince denied any wrongdoing and said he had no current business in Russia, but the footage was awkward in the extreme. A working member of the extended royal family, filmed appearing to trade on the family name. The point, for our purposes, is a plain one. The Kents were a couple, and the reputation for causing the palace discomfort was never hers to carry alone. Which brings us back to the harder question underneath all of it. The easy version of Princess Michael of Kent is the one the nickname wrote. Grasping, grand, insensitive, a woman who married a prince and then behaved as if the whole apparatus of monarchy existed to flatter her. That version is available in 40 years of cuttings, and parts of it are supported by the record. But it has to be set against a second version, quieter and far less satisfying, because a fair account has to hold both at once. In that second version, she was an outsider the British establishment decided very early it did not want, and then treated accordingly. She came from the wrong country, with the wrong religion, a divorce behind her, a father with a ruinous history she said she had never known, and a manner that a certain kind of English courtier finds unforgivable in a foreigner and charming in one of their own. She was given a cruel nickname before she had done much to earn it, and once she wore it, everything she did afterward was read through it. She built a real career as a writer while being dismissed as a dabbler. She raised 2 children who grew up largely clear of scandal. She held a marriage together for decades in the coldest of climates. And when she made real mistakes, and she made several, they were punished with an appetite that more senior and better protected royals were rarely made to face. Both of those women are real. The truth of her sits somewhere in the friction between them, and no honest telling can flatten it onto one side. But there is a third figure in this story who usually gets left out of it, and that is the institution itself. Because whatever Princess Michael was, difficult or maligned or a measure of both, the people who ran the royal household were not blind. They knew about the SS revelation, and they managed it. The money and the apartment were no secret to anyone inside the palace, and they let that run until it could not run any longer. The reputation, the nickname, the pattern, the risk she carried to the family's image, all of it was visible from the inside, and across 40 years, the household made a choice more interesting than anything she ever wore to lunch. It kept her close to the family, inside the palace, on the family tree, and at the Christmas table, and it absorbed each new headline as the cost of keeping her there. The phrase people reached for was that she was a nasty piece of work. The part that seldom gets said out loud is that the palace knew and decided, over and over again, that knowing was not the same as acting. Why the institution made that choice, what it reveals about how the monarchy shields its own and polices its outsiders, and whether the woman at the center of it was a villain, a scapegoat, or simply somebody the system was never going to allow to win, is what the next 2.5 hours will take apart, slowly and in order, beginning at the very start. So we begin where she began, in a defeated country, in the last weeks of a lost war, in a family about to lose almost everything it had, carrying a name that would open doors in one century and slam them in the next. To understand the woman the palace could neither fully accept nor quite bring itself to remove, you have to understand the child born into the wreckage of one empire, who spent the rest of her life trying to find a place inside another. Her story starts there. To be born in Carlsbad in the winter of 1945 was to be born on a fault line at the moment it finally gave way. The town itself was old and elegant, a place of colonnades and mineral springs, where the wealthy of Europe had come for a century to take the waters and be seen taking them. Emperors had walked its promenades. Composers had written there. It had the settled, gilded confidence of somewhere that assumed it would always be exactly what it was. In January of that year, it was also, quietly, living on borrowed time, and so was the entire world that had produced the baby girl now carrying the name von Reibnitz. The region around it had a name that would soon become one of the most bitterly contested words in 20th century Europe. The Sudetenland. For centuries, this belt of territory along the edges of Bohemia and Moravia had been home to a large population of German speakers, people whose families had lived there for generations, under the old Austro-Hungarian order, when borders mattered less because a single sprawling empire contained them all. When that empire collapsed at the end of the First World War, the map was redrawn, and these German-speaking districts found themselves inside the new state of Czechoslovakia, a Slavic majority country in which they were now a minority. The seed of a grievance was planted there in 1918, and it would be harvested with catastrophic results 20 years on. In 1938, Adolf Hitler used the discontent of the Sudeten Germans as the lever for one of the most infamous acts of appeasement in modern history. He demanded the region for Germany, on the argument that its German population wished to be reunited with the Reich, and at Munich, the leaders of Britain and France agreed to hand it over rather than risk war. It bought a year of peace and cost a great deal more than that. The Sudetenland became German. The rest of Czechoslovakia was swallowed soon after, and the people of that border region, the German speakers Hitler had claimed to be rescuing, were folded into a Reich that would drag them through 6 years of war and then abandon them to the reckoning that followed. That reckoning is the world Marie-Christine was born into. By the start of 1945, the war in Europe was all but decided. The Red Army was driving west. The Reich that had absorbed Carlsbad was weeks from collapse. And across the lands that Germany had occupied and colonized, a vast and violent unwinding was about to begin, one that would fall with particular force on exactly the sort of family into which she had just arrived. When the war ended in the spring of that year, the newly restored Czechoslovak government moved to solve what it regarded as the German problem once and for all. In a series of measures that came to be known by the name of the country's president, Edvard Beneš, the state stripped the ethnic German population of the border regions of their citizenship, their property, and their right to remain. What followed was one of the largest forced movements of people in European history. Something on the order of 3 million German speakers were expelled from Czechoslovakia in the months and years after the war, driven out of homes their families had held for generations, herded to the frontier, and pushed into a shattered Germany that had little room and less sympathy for them. The expulsions were often brutal. Thousands died. An entire civilization of German-speaking Bohemia, centuries in the making, was dismantled in a matter of seasons. This is not a detour. This is the ground the story stands on. The infant girl in Carlsbad belonged, by birth, to the losing side of that unwinding. She was a German-speaking child of the aristocracy, born in the last weeks of a regime that was about to be crushed, in a town that was about to expel people exactly like her. The comfortable, settled, gilded Europe her family names implied had already ceased to exist by the time she was old enough to walk. She would grow up not as the daughter of a great house on its ancestral land, but as one of the scattered remnants of a vanished order, part of a whole generation of displaced Central European aristocrats who carried the titles of a world that no longer had a place for them. It is worth sitting with that, because so much of what the British press and public would later hold against her makes a different kind of sense in its light. The hunger for status, the insistence on her own rank, the determination to be received as what she believed herself to be. Critics would read all of it as vanity, as the pushiness the nickname named. Some of it surely was. But some of it was the reflex of someone whose family had been stripped of everything except its names, clinging hard to the one form of wealth the war had left her, which was the claim to be somebody. When you have lost the estates, the country, and the world that gave your title meaning, the title itself can become the thing you defend most fiercely, precisely because it is all that remains. Her family, the von Reibnitzes, came from Silesia, another of those contested borderlands that changed hands and flags across the centuries. Silesian nobility of the old school were landowners, soldiers, and servants of whichever crown happened to hold the region at the time, and their world ran on land, lineage, and the quiet certainties of rank. That world, too, was destroyed at the end of the war. Silesia, long a part of the German lands, was transferred to Poland, and its German population expelled in the same great tide that emptied the Sudetenland. The estates that families like the von Reibnitzes had held for generations were simply gone, absorbed into a redrawn map, never to be recovered. Whatever the Baron had once expected to pass to his children, the war took it before his daughter was 2 years old. So the child had a father with a title and no land, a mother with a title and a failing marriage, and a birthplace that would shortly expel everyone of her background. It is difficult to imagine a less stable foundation for a life, and yet in another sense the instability was the making of her. A settled aristocrat stays on the estate. A dispossessed one has to move, adapt, marry well, and reinvent, and Marie-Christine would prove to be very good indeed at all four. The restlessness that her critics later mistook for ambition was, at the root, a survival skill learned in a family that had run out of ground to stand on. We know less about her infancy than we would like, and much of what circulates about these earliest years should be treated with care, because the record is thin, and the woman herself was not always a reliable narrator of her own past. What is clear is the shape of it. She was born into loss. The war that ended when she was an infant took the world her names belonged to, and the family that carried her out of Central Europe was carrying her away from a home that had already stopped existing, toward a future that would have to be built somewhere else, out of almost nothing but the past. Every account of Princess Michael of Kent eventually circles back to her father, because her father is where the darkest chapter of her public life begins, and because the man himself is harder to pin down than either his defenders or his accusers have usually allowed. Baron Gunther Hubertus von Reibnitz was a Silesian nobleman of the generation that came of age between the two world wars, in a Germany that had lost the first and was sliding, through the 1920s and 30s, toward the catastrophe of the second. To understand him at all, you have to understand the trap that his class walked into during those years. The old German aristocracy had emerged from the First World War, stripped of much of its former standing. The monarchy was gone. The empire was gone. Inflation and upheaval had savaged the fortunes of many noble families. And into that wounded, resentful world came a movement that promised to restore German greatness, to punish the enemies within, and to sweep away the humiliations of defeat. A great many of the old aristocracy, though certainly not all, found reasons to make their peace with it, and some embraced it outright. What is documented, and what would detonate across the British newspapers in 1985, is that Baron von Reibnitz became a member of the Nazi Party and of the SS. The SS was not an ordinary organization. It was the black uniformed core of the regime, the body that ran the concentration camps and carried out the worst of the crimes that would define the Reich forever. To have belonged to it at all is a fact that no amount of context can soften into nothing. When a British investigation established that Princess Michael's father had held SS membership, it handed the public a single damning image, and that image, once printed, could never be recalled. But the fuller story that historians and biographers reconstructed afterward is more complicated than the headline, and honesty requires that the complication be stated as plainly as the charge. By the accounts that emerged, the Baron's relationship with the regime was not one of untroubled loyalty. There are indications that he fell into conflict with the party authorities, that he was investigated or disciplined, and that his standing within the movement was, at various points, anything but secure. Some accounts describe a man whose personal life and associations brought him under suspicion from the very machine he had joined. This does not make him a resistor. It does not turn an SS member into a hero. What it does is complicate the cartoon and replace a simple villain with something harder to categorize. A man who joined a monstrous movement and then found himself, in ways that remain only partly documented, at odds with it. For our purposes, the crucial point is not the final verdict on the Baron. It is the distance between the father and the daughter. Marie-Christine was born in 1945, at the very end of the war. Her parents' marriage broke up soon afterward. Her father, by her own account and by the general shape of the record, was not a constant presence in her childhood, and he died when she was still young. Whatever he had been, whatever he had done, and whatever conflicts he had passed through inside the regime, his daughter grew up largely without him, and she would always insist that she had known almost nothing of his wartime record until the newspapers put it in front of her as an adult. Is that believable? It is one of the questions the story keeps returning to, and there is no way to settle it with certainty. On one side, a great many children of that generation genuinely did grow up in a fog of silence about what their parents had done in the war, because the whole of German society, in the decades after 1945, became expert at not discussing it. Silence was the norm, not the exception. A girl raised away from her father, in other countries, in a family that had every reason to bury its past rather than examine it, could plausibly have reached adulthood, knowing the names and the titles, and none of the uniform. On the other side, skeptics have always found it convenient that a woman so attentive to her own lineage, so fluent in the details of her ancestry, should have been so entirely in the dark about this one enormous fact. The truth is probably unrecoverable. What can be said is that her account is not, on its face, impossible, and that the certainty with which some of her critics rejected it says as much about their appetite for her guilt as it does about the evidence. The deeper significance of the Baron, for the woman his daughter became, lies in what he represented, rather than what he did. He was the embodiment of the lost world she had been born into, the Silesian estate, the noble name, the vanished certainties of the old order, and also its shame, the way that same aristocracy had entangled itself with the worst regime in modern history. She inherited both halves of that legacy whether she wanted them or not. She inherited the pride, the sense of rank, the insistence on lineage that would exasperate the English establishment for decades, and she inherited the shadow, the family history that would, in one brutal week in 1985, be dragged into the light and hung around her neck. There is a cruelty in that inheritance worth naming clearly. A child does not choose her father. She does not select the century she is born into, or the movements her parents join, or the crimes committed by a state before she could speak. Marie-Christine von Reibnitz was an infant when the war ended. By any moral standard, the actions of her father were not hers, and could not be. And yet, when the story broke, she was made to carry them, because she was a public figure, because she was already disliked, and because the image of a princess with an SS father was too irresistible a headline for the newspapers to handle with care. The sins of the father were visited on the daughter, quite literally, in print, 4 decades after the war had ended and the father himself had died. That is the world she came from, a great house with no house left, a noble name with a stain built into it. A father who was both the symbol of everything she had lost and the source of the accusation that would follow her for life. She would spend her years trying to build something solid on that foundation. And the remarkable thing, given the materials, is not that she sometimes overreached. The remarkable thing is that she got as far as she did. If the first fact of Marie-Christine's life was loss, the second was distance. She did not grow up in the world her names came from, because that world was gone. She grew up instead in the long aftermath of its destruction, moving between countries, raised largely by a mother who had to remake a life from the wreckage of a marriage and a war at the same time. Her parents separated in the years just after her birth, and the family that might, in an earlier age, have raised her on a Silesian estate scattered across the map instead. Her mother, Countess Shapari, was left to bring up her children a long way from the Europe that had defeated them, and Marie-Christine's upbringing was divided between continents in a way that would have been unthinkable for a girl of her background a single generation before. Part of her early life was spent far from Europe altogether. Part of her schooling was completed in England, in the care of a convent, where a German-speaking aristocratic girl, with a chain of unfamiliar names, learned to move through a very different society. The specifics of these years are patchily recorded, and sometimes contradictory, and they are the sort of biographical detail that deserves a careful verification against the documents before anyone states them as settled fact. What is not in doubt is the pattern. She was a child of everywhere and nowhere, at home in several languages, and fully rooted in none of the countries she passed through. That upbringing left marks that would define her for the rest of her life, and they are worth drawing out, because they explain a great deal about the woman England would later find so hard to place. She emerged from it fluent in languages, poised, and formidably self-possessed, the product of an education designed to turn well-born girls into women who could hold a room. She emerged from it with an unusually sharp sense of her own rank, because rank was the one inheritance the war had not taken, and a dispossessed aristocrat learns early to guard the little that is left. And she emerged from it as an outsider by instinct, someone who had never quite belonged anywhere, and who had learned to compensate for not belonging by insisting, all the more firmly, on who she was. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from displacement, and she had it. It is not the easy, unspoken confidence of the native aristocrat, who has never had to wonder whether the room will accept her. It is the harder, more brittle confidence of the newcomer, who has decided that if she carries herself as though she belongs, the world will eventually agree. The trouble with that kind of confidence is that it reads, to the settled and the secure, as pushing. The English upper class, in particular, has always been suspicious of anyone who seems to be trying, because trying gives the game away, and the whole point of inherited status is to appear never to have tried at all. Marie-Christine, arriving from outside, would spend her life trying, visibly, to claim a place, and the English would spend their time punishing her for it. By the time she reached young adulthood, she had turned herself into something impressive. She was tall, striking, and stylish, with the kind of continental glamour that stood out in the greyer world of post-war Britain. She had taste, and she had a good eye, and she put both to work. She trained and worked in interior design, building a professional life around the aesthetics of beautiful rooms and beautiful objects, a natural fit for a woman raised on the memory of grand houses she had never got to live in. She was not, in these years, a member of the royal family or anything close to it. She was a young aristocratic émigrée, making her own way in London, earning a living, and moving up through the layers of a society that both fascinated her and held her at arm's length. And here we should pause on a truth that the later caricature almost entirely erased. She worked. Whatever else can be said about Princess Michael of Kent, and a great deal can, she was not a woman who simply floated on inherited money into a royal marriage. There was no inherited money to float on. Her family's fortune had been destroyed. Her father was largely absent and then dead. She built her early life through her own effort, her own eye, and her own considerable determination, in a country that was not hers, in a language that was not her first. The image of the grasping social climber, endlessly repeated, leaves out the fact that the woman doing the climbing had started from the bottom of a collapsed world and hauled herself up by whatever holds she could find. Ambition looks uglier when you forget how far the person had to climb. She was, in short, a self-made aristocrat, which is very nearly a contradiction in terms, and the contradiction was the source of both her strength and her trouble. She had the bearing of the old nobility and the hunger of the newly arrived. She could talk lineage with anyone, and had rebuilt her own life from nothing. That combination made her compelling to some and insufferable to others, and it guaranteed that whatever world she entered, she would never sit quietly in the corner of it. She had come too far, from too little, to disappear into the wallpaper of anyone else's drawing room. What she needed now was a door into the world she felt she belonged in, the world of settled rank and old names and real security, the world the war had stolen from her family before she was old enough to remember it. London society was the antechamber to that world. And it was in London, in the fashionable, moneyed circles she was steadily entering, that she would make her first serious attempt to walk through the door, by way of a marriage that would end in failure and leave behind a complication the Roman Catholic Church would take years to resolve. The London that Marie-Christine was climbing through in the 1960s and early 70s was a city in the middle of reinventing itself, and it suited a reinventor. The old rigidities of class were loosening, at least at the edges. Money and glamour and a certain kind of style could carry a person into rooms that birth alone had once guarded. For a striking, multilingual young aristocrat with continental polish and a professional eye, there were opportunities to be found, and she found them. She moved in circles where old titles mixed with new money, where the fashionable and the well-connected gathered, and where a woman who could hold herself like a baroness and talk with genuine knowledge about art and history and the courts of Europe had something to offer. She was building a professional reputation in interior design at the same time, which gave her both an income and an entry point, because the business of beautiful houses put her in constant contact with the people who owned them. She was, by every account, hard to overlook. She had presence. She filled a doorway. In this world she met, and in 1971 married, Thomas Trowbridge, an English banker from a family with its own naval and baronet connections. It was, on the surface, a sensible match, an ambitious continental aristocrat marrying into the solid English establishment she was trying to join. Marriage to a man like Trowbridge was a step toward the settled English respectability she had been reaching for, a way of anchoring her drifting, borderless life to something stable and native and secure. It did not last. The marriage ran into difficulty, and the couple separated within a few years. By the mid-1970s, the union that was meant to anchor her had failed, and she was, once again, a woman between lives, no longer quite where she had been, and not yet where she was going. In the strict terms of the world she was trying to enter, a separated and then divorced young woman was a complicated proposition, particularly a Roman Catholic one, for whom divorce carried a religious weight that a civil decree could not lift. That religious weight is the detail that turns this first marriage from a footnote into a hinge. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, a valid marriage is not something a civil court can dissolve. For Marie-Christine to remarry within her faith, and above all to remarry into a family as scrutinized as the one she would eventually join, the Church itself would have to declare that the first marriage had not been a true marriage at all, through the process known as annulment. That process was neither quick nor guaranteed, and the unresolved question of it would hang over her second wedding and shape the strange, half-public, half-withheld way that wedding finally happened. The failure of the Trowbridge marriage did not just end a relationship, it planted a legal and religious obstacle that would still be casting a shadow years later, when the man she married was a prince and the wedding was a matter of state. For now, though, in the middle of the 1970s, she was simply a woman whose first attempt at the settled life had come apart, and who was not the sort to retreat quietly into disappointment. Whatever else the years had taught her, they had taught her to keep moving. She had rebuilt before. She would rebuild again. And the circles she moved in, where the aristocratic and the royal brushed constantly against one another, were about to bring her into the orbit of a man who was, in his own quiet way, as much of an outsider inside his own family as she was in the country she had adopted. Because the striking thing about the match that was coming is that it was not, as the later story often implied, a case of a scheming outsider capturing an unsuspecting prince. It was, in many ways, a meeting of two people who did not quite fit. She was the dispossessed foreign aristocrat trying to find a home in the English establishment, He was the overlooked royal cousin, a serious and slightly solitary man who had grown up in the long shadow of a glamorous dead father and a family that had little obvious use for him. Neither of them was at the center of anything. Both of them were, in different ways, standing at the edge of the world they had been born to. When they found each other, they were not so much predator and prey as two people at the margins recognizing something familiar in one another. To understand why the prince was standing at that margin in the first place, we have to leave Marie-Christine for a while and turn to the family he came from, and to the particular emptiness at the heart of his own beginnings. Prince Michael of Kent was born on the 4th of July 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, into a family that was about to be struck by a loss it never fully absorbed. His father was Prince George, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary, a charming, cultured, and complicated man who was, by the standards of that famously stiff family, unusually glamorous. His mother was Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, a woman of famed elegance and continental royal pedigree who brought a note of European style into the British royal house. Michael was their third and youngest child, arriving after his brother, Prince Edward, and his sister, Princess Alexandra. There is a detail about his birth that says something about the world his family moved in even in wartime. One of his godparents was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, then leading his country through the war alongside Britain. A royal baby with an American president for a godfather, born on American Independence Day, was a small piece of wartime symbolism, a tie between two allied nations stitched into the christening of a child. It was the last uncomplicated moment of his infancy. 7 weeks after Michael was born, his father was dead. In August of 1942, the Duke of Kent was killed when the Royal Air Force flying boat carrying him crashed into a hillside in the north of Scotland while he was on active wartime service. Almost everyone aboard died. The Duke was 39 years old. His youngest son was less than 2 months old and would grow up with no memory of him at all, only the photographs, the stories, and the long shadow of a father who had been young, dazzling, and suddenly gone. That absence shaped everything. Michael grew up as the posthumous child, the boy who never knew his father, in a family already defined by the glittering, tragic figure of the Duke who had died in the war. His mother, Princess Marina, raised her 3 children in reduced circumstances by royal standards, a widow bringing up a young family in the austere years of wartime and post-war Britain. Michael was the youngest, the one furthest from the center, growing up in a household organized around a grief that predated his own consciousness. As he grew, he settled into the role that the arithmetic of royal birth assigned him. His older brother, Edward, inherited their father's dukedom and became the new Duke of Kent, taking on the seniority and the public duties that came with it. His sister, Alexandra, would become one of the hardest-working and best-liked members of the wider family. Michael, the younger son of a younger son, occupied a place far down the order of precedence, close enough to the throne to be unmistakably royal, far enough from it to be permanently in the background. He was the kind of royal the public could never quite name, present at the great occasions, visible in the family photographs, and central to almost nothing. He made his life in the army, as men of his position traditionally did. He was commissioned as a cavalry officer, served with distinction over a number of years, and took to military life with genuine seriousness. Soldiering suited him. It gave a structure and a purpose to a man who was never going to be handed a great public role by birth, and it was a world where competence mattered more than precedence. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, intelligent, diligent, and reserved, a man more comfortable with detail and duty than with the performance of royalty. And then there was Russia. 2 things about Prince Michael drew the eye more than anything else in his public life, and both pointed east. The first was his face. As he grew older and grew his beard, the resemblance became uncanny. He looked, to a startling degree, like Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, the last emperor, murdered with his family in the revolution. This was not mere coincidence of features. Through the tangled intermarriages of European royalty, Michael carried Russian imperial blood in his own veins, a cousinship to the vanished Romanovs written across his own face. The second was his lifelong fascination with the country of that lost dynasty. He learned Russian. He immersed himself in the history and the culture of Imperial Russia, and in later life he built extensive business interests connected to the country, interests that would, decades on, land him in serious public embarrassment. The Romanov thread ran through his whole existence, from the shape of his face to the shape of his troubles. Put the portrait together, and you have a man who was, in his own quiet way, as much an outsider inside his family as Marie Christine was outside hers. He was royal, but marginal. He was serious, in a role that offered him little serious to do. He had grown up without the father whose glamour still defined the family, and he carried the face of a murdered emperor from a dynasty that no longer existed. He was not a natural fit for the ceremonial, smiling, front-of-house version of royalty. He was a soldier and a scholar of lost causes, standing a long way from the center of the family that had produced him. When such a man met a striking, dispossessed foreign aristocrat who was also standing at the edge of a world she was trying to enter, the attraction is not hard to understand, and it does not require the villainy the later story insisted on. Here were two intelligent, somewhat solitary people, both marginal to the establishments they had been born into or were trying to join, both carrying the weight of vanished worlds, both looking for a place to belong. He offered her the door into the settled royal world she had reached for all her life. She offered him a partner of real force and intelligence, a woman as serious and as hungry as he was quiet. It was, on both sides, a meeting of outsiders. What neither of them could have fully reckoned with was how completely the establishment they were joining would decide that one of them did not belong, and how long, and how publicly, it would make her pay for the intrusion. When Prince Michael and Marie Christine decided to marry, they collided with a piece of English law more than 2.5 centuries old, and with a religious divide that the English state had spent those centuries treating as a matter of national survival. The obstacle was not scandal, at least not at first. The obstacle was that she was a Roman Catholic, and he was in the line of succession to a Protestant throne. The relevant law was the Act of Settlement of 1701, one of the foundation stones of the modern British Constitution. It was written in an age when the question of whether a Catholic might sit on the English throne had been the cause of civil war, revolution, and the removal of a king. To settle that question for good, Parliament laid down that the crown would pass only through Protestant heirs, and that any member of the royal family who married a Roman Catholic would be removed from the line of succession, as though they had died. The provision was not a piece of ceremony. It was a hard rule with real force, and it had stood, unamended, from the reign of Queen Anne into the reign of Elizabeth II. For Prince Michael, the arithmetic was brutal in principle and almost weightless in practice. He was a long way down the order of succession, far enough that his chance of ever reaching the throne was effectively nil. But the law made no distinction between the heir and the 30th in line. Marry a Catholic and you were out. So when Michael chose Marie Christine, he chose to give up his place in the succession, formally and publicly, a sacrifice that cost him nothing he was ever going to use, and yet marked him, symbolically, as a man who had put a Catholic wife ahead of his position in the Protestant royal line. It was the first of several ways in which their marriage announced her, from the very beginning, as the wrong sort of match. There was a second obstacle, and it came from the other direction, from Rome rather than from London. Marie Christine was not only a Catholic, she was a Catholic who had been married before, to Thomas Trowbridge, in a union that the Church still regarded as valid. For her to marry Prince Michael within her faith, that first marriage would have to be annulled, formally declared to have never been a true marriage in the eyes of the Church. And there was a further complication layered on top of that. Rome's willingness to sanction the new marriage depended in part on the question of how any children would be raised, and here, the demands of the Catholic Church and the demands of the British establishment pointed in opposite directions. The Church expected the children of a Catholic mother to be brought up Catholic. The British royal family, and the Protestant succession it embodied, could not possibly allow that. Something had to give. What gave was the religious wedding. When the couple married, on the 30th of June 1978, they did so in a civil ceremony at the town hall in Vienna, not in a Catholic church, and not in an Anglican one. The Vatican, at that stage, had not granted the dispensation that would have allowed a full Catholic wedding, in part because the couple had agreed that their children would be raised in the Church of England rather than in their mother's faith. So the marriage that joined a cousin of the Queen to a Catholic baroness took place in a municipal building in a foreign capital, without the blessing of either of the great churches that had a stake in it. It was a strange, muted beginning for a royal marriage, and it set the tone perfectly. She had already given up the promise that her children would share her religion. He had already given up his place in the succession. Between them, they had surrendered a great deal before the marriage had drawn its first breath, and still it began under a cloud, in a register office abroad, because no church would yet fully own it. The religious blessing did eventually come. In time, once her first marriage had been formally annulled by the church, the couple received a Catholic blessing, and the union was regularized in the eyes of Rome. But the sequence of events left its mark on the public record and on the public mind. The story of the Vienna wedding, the initial refusal, the compromise over the children, the whole awkward, negotiated, half-sanctioned quality of it, fed straight into the emerging picture of Marie-Christine as a problem the establishment had reluctantly accepted, rather than a bride it had welcomed. She entered the family through a side door, and everyone knew it. There is a strange and telling coda to the succession part of the story, one that arrived decades later and quietly reversed the original sacrifice. In the 21st century, Parliament finally reformed the old rules of royal succession. The Succession to the Crown Act, passed in 2013 and brought into force a couple of years afterward, swept away several of the ancient provisions, including the automatic exclusion of those who married Roman Catholics. Under the new law, marrying a Catholic no longer cost a royal their place in the line. And so Prince Michael, who had given up his place in the succession in 1978 for the sake of marrying a Catholic, was restored to it, more than 30 years later, when the law that had removed him was itself removed. The barrier that had marked his marriage as a transgression at the start had, by the end, been judged an anachronism and abolished. It is a small piece of history with a large lesson buried in it. The rules that the establishment treats as eternal and non-negotiable in one generation are quietly discarded in the next, and the people punished under the old rules rarely get their years back. Marie-Christine spent decades as the Catholic wife who had cost a prince his place in the line. By the time the country decided that this had never really mattered, the reputation built on it had long since hardened into fact. She was married now, and she was royal. Whatever the awkwardness of the ceremony, the outcome was real. The dispossessed baroness from a vanished country had done what would once have seemed impossible for a girl who had started with nothing but names. She had married into the House of Windsor. She had a title that began with the word princess. She had walked through the door she had been reaching for her whole life, and on the other side of that door, waiting for her, was a British establishment that had already looked her over, decided what it thought of her, and begun, with quiet and remorseless efficiency, to make its verdict known. There is a small and easily overlooked fact about what happened to her at the wedding, and once you notice it, it becomes hard to stop noticing, because it turns out to hold, in miniature, the whole shape of her story. When Marie-Christine von Reibnitz married Prince Michael of Kent, she did not become Princess Marie-Christine. She became Princess Michael of Kent. Her public identity, from that day forward, was built entirely out of her husband's name, and her own given name, the Marie-Christine she had carried through a whole life of upheaval and reinvention, simply vanished from the title the world would know her by. This was not a slight aimed at her personally. It was the ordinary working of British royal style, and it applied to women in her position across the generations. A woman who is not royal by birth, who becomes a princess only through marriage, does not receive a title in her own name. She takes her husband's, forename and all. So the wives of princes who are known by their own forenames become, in the old formula, princess, followed by the husband's name, and their own names disappear from the style entirely. Marie-Christine was simply following the rule that governed everyone like her, absorbed into the convention that had swallowed the names of such wives for a very long time. There was nothing unusual in it, and nothing directed at her. And yet, of all the women to whom this convention applied, it is hard to think of one for whom it was more cruelly apt. Here was a woman whose entire life had been a struggle for identity, for status, for the right to be recognized as who she believed herself to be. She had lost her country, her family's fortune, and the world her names belonged to, and she had clung all the harder, through all of it, to the one thing the war had not taken, the claim to be somebody, to bear a name that meant something. She had fought her whole life to be known. And the reward, at the summit of that fight, the prize she had reached for through every reinvention, was a royal title that erased her own name and replaced it with her husband's. She won her place in the family, and the price of the place was her name. She became a princess, and in becoming one, she disappeared into a man's forename, known forever after not as herself, but as an appendage of the prince she had married. The symbolism is almost too neat, and it would feel invented if it were not simply true. The outsider is admitted to the family, but only as a possession of the insider, only as the wife of, only under a name that is not her own. She is inside the walls, and even her name inside the walls is borrowed. The title that marked her arrival was also, read another way, a small monument to her erasure, a public declaration that she existed, in the eyes of the institution, chiefly as the attachment of a prince, rather than as a person in her own right. The woman who had spent decades insisting on who she was, ended up officially known by who she had married, and the two facts sat together, all her life, in the single line of her title. It is worth holding this next to the nickname, because the two things did the same work from opposite directions. The formal title, Princess Michael of Kent, erased her name by absorbing her into her husband. The informal name, Princess Pushy, erased her by reducing her to a single mocking judgment. Between them, the official style and the tabloid label, she was left almost nowhere as herself. To the establishment, she was the wife of Prince Michael, her own name gone. To the public, she was Princess Pushy, her whole self compressed into an insult. The one place she was hardly ever allowed to be, in the official record, or the popular one, was simply Marie Christine, a particular human being, with a particular life, the displaced child who had built something out of the wreckage. Both the family and the press, in their different ways, had taken her name away from her and given her theirs instead. That is the quiet tragedy, folded into the styling convention, and it runs underneath everything that followed. A woman who wanted above all to be recognized, spent her public life under two names that were both, in the end, forms of not being seen. The title made her her husband's. The nickname made her the tabloids. And the person underneath, the one who had actually lived the extraordinary life, the one this whole account has been trying to recover, was left standing behind both of them, largely unnamed and largely unseen, which is, when you come down to it, exactly what the whole story has been about. Nicknames are a form of judgment, and the one the British press fastened onto Marie Christine was a verdict delivered before most of the country had heard her speak. They called her Princess Pushy, and the name did exactly what it was designed to do. It reduced a complicated woman to a single accusation, made that accusation sound like an established fact, and gave the public a ready-made lens through which every subsequent thing she did would be viewed. Once you have been named Princess Pushy, there is no neutral behavior left available to you. Stand your ground and you are pushy. Assert your rank and you are pushy. Ask for what you believe you are owed and you are pushy. The nickname is a trap, and it was sprung on her early. Where did it come from? Partly from her manner, which was, by many accounts, genuinely grand. She carried herself with the bearing of the old aristocracy, insisted on the proper forms of address, and made no secret of her sense of her own lineage. To English eyes, and especially to the eyes of the born aristocrats who set the tone at court, this was insufferable, because the unspoken rule of English upper-class life is that real status never has to announce itself. The truly grand, in that world, affect a studied casualness, a deliberate underplaying, precisely because their position is so secure that it needs no defending. A woman who defended hers loudly, who reached for the titles, and the precedence, and the recognition, was breaking the deepest code of the class she was trying to join. She was doing out loud what the natives did in silence, and nothing marks an outsider more surely than getting the volume wrong. But the nickname was about more than manner, and this is the part that is easy to miss. It was also about origin. She was foreign. She was a German speaker in a country that had fought 2 wars against Germany within living memory. She was Catholic in a royal family defined by its Protestantism. She was a divorcee in an institution that had convulsed itself over divorce a generation earlier. She had a father whose history, once revealed, would confirm every dark suspicion the label carried. She was, in nearly every particular, the outsider the establishment was primed to reject, and Princess Pushy was the polite, deniable way of rejecting her. You could not print that she was disliked for being foreign, Catholic, and self-made. You could print that she was pushy. The nickname did the work of prejudice while keeping prejudice's hands clean. It is worth being precise here, because this is a point that cuts in more than one direction, and honesty demands both edges of it. Some of the criticism of her manner was surely fair. There are accounts, over many years and from many quarters, of a woman who could be imperious, demanding, and difficult, who stood on ceremony, who expected a great deal, and who did not always make life easy for those around her. Those accounts are too numerous and too consistent to dismiss as pure invention. A fair verdict has to allow that the woman behind the nickname was, at least some of the time, genuinely hard work. The point is not that the criticism was baseless. The point is that the same behavior would have been read very differently in a woman the establishment had decided to embrace. Grandeur in a favored royal is dignity. Grandeur in an unwelcome one is arrogance. The behavior is identical. Only the sympathy changes, and the establishment had decided, very early, to extend her none. The contrast with how the family treated its own is instructive. The British royal family has never been short of difficult personalities, of demanding tempers, of members who made staff miserable and expected the world to arrange itself around their preferences. That is nearly a job requirement at the top of an institution built on deference. Yet the difficult ones who were born to the family, or who married in with the establishment's blessing, were generally protected, their sharp edges filed off in the telling, their tempers described, when described at all, as the understandable strain of a demanding life. Marie Christine received no such generosity. Her every hard edge was reported, magnified, and offered to the public as proof of the verdict the nickname had already delivered. The insiders were forgiven their faults. The outsider was defined by hers. There was also, running under all of it, the plain fact of class snobbery, dressed up as national feeling and personal distaste. The English aristocracy has a long and well-practiced talent for making an outsider feel the difference between arriving and belonging. It is done through 1,000 small signals: the raised eyebrow, the faint coolness, the joke made just out of earshot, the sense conveyed without a single actionable word that you are here on sufferance and everyone knows it. Marie Christine, who had spent her whole life trying to belong somewhere, walked into the most exclusive establishment in the country and was met with exactly that treatment, refined over centuries to a fine and deniable art. She was inside the palace and outside the family at the same time, and she felt it, and it made her push harder, which confirmed the nickname, which justified the coldness, which made her push harder still. It was a closed loop, and she was caught in it from the beginning. What makes the nickname so revealing, in the end, is not what it says about her, but what it says about the machine that produced it. Because a nickname like that does not stick without help. It requires a press willing to repeat it, a public ready to believe it, and, crucially, an establishment content to let it stand. The palace could not have stopped the newspapers from coining it, but the palace could, over the years, have done a great deal to soften it, to fold her more warmly into the family's public life, to signal that she was valued and protected and one of them. It largely did not. The coldness that the nickname expressed was not only the invention of the tabloids. It reflected, at least in part, a genuine reluctance inside the institution to fully own the outsider it had reluctantly admitted. The press named her. The public repeated the name. And the palace, for the most part, let the name do its work, absorbing the woman while never quite defending her, keeping her close enough to be family and distant enough to disown. That pattern, established at the very start, would hold for the rest of her life. By the spring of 1985, Princess Michael of Kent had been a member of the British royal family for close to 7 years. She had a title, 2 young children, a place at the great state occasions, and a public profile that was already, thanks to the nickname and the tabloid attention, larger and more colourful than that of most minor royals. She was established. Whatever the establishment privately thought of her, she was inside the tent. And then a British newspaper investigation walked up and pulled the ground out from under her in the space of a single news cycle. The story was that her father, Baron Gunther von Reibnitz, had been a member of the SS. For a public that had grown up on the memory of the war, no word carried a heavier charge. The SS was shorthand for the machinery of the Holocaust, for the camps and the killings, for the very worst that the 20th century had produced. To learn that a woman who curtsied to the Queen and appeared on the palace balcony had a father who had worn that uniform was, for the newspapers and their readers, an irresistible collision of the glamorous and the monstrous. The headlines wrote themselves, and they were merciless. Her response, when it came, was not the response of a woman with a prepared defense. It was the response of someone genuinely knocked sideways. She spoke publicly about her shock and her distress. She said she had not known the details of her father's wartime record, that he had died when she was a child, that she had grown up largely apart from him, and that the discovery had wounded her deeply. She did not attempt to deny the documented fact of his membership, because it could not be denied. What she disputed was the idea that his membership told the whole story of the man, and that whatever he had been, it belonged to him and not to her. The more careful reconstruction of the Baron's record, which followed in the weeks and years after the initial storm, complicated the picture in ways we have already seen. A man whose relationship with the regime included conflict and suspicion as well as membership. But those complications arrived late and traveled slowly, while the original headline had traveled at once and reached everyone. That is the cruelty of this kind of revelation. The accusation is a spear, and the correction is a whisper. By the time anyone qualified the story, the image of the princess with the SS father had already set like concrete in the public mind, and there it stayed. Here is the question that matters for the larger story, and it is a question about the institution as much as about the woman. What did the royal family do when one of its own was suddenly revealed to have a father with an SS past? It did not cast her out. There was no distancing statement, no quiet removal, no signal that she was now too radioactive to remain within the family. The institution weathered the blow and kept her exactly where she was. Whatever discomfort the revelation caused behind palace walls, and it must have caused a great deal, the outcome was that Princess Michael of Kent remained Princess Michael of Kent, in the family, in the palace apartments, at the Christmas table, on the tree. That decision is worth holding up to the light, because it is the first clear instance of the pattern this whole story is built around. Confronted with a genuine crisis attached to the outsider it had reluctantly admitted, the establishment chose absorption over expulsion. It decided that the damage of keeping her was more manageable than the drama of removing her. And in this particular case, that decision was almost certainly the right and decent one, because the sins in question were her father's and not hers, and a family that threw out a woman for the crimes of a parent she had never really known would have been committing an injustice of its own. The point is not that the palace was wrong to keep her. The point is that the palace made a choice, quietly and deliberately, to keep her through a scandal that would have finished a lesser connected figure, and that it would go on making versions of that same choice, again and again, for the rest of her life. The institution knew how to absorb an embarrassment. It had just given itself a demonstration. There is a final, uncomfortable truth folded into the 1985 revelation, and it points forward to everything that came after. The story landed as hard as it did, in part because she was already disliked. A more beloved royal, revealed to have a difficult family history, might have been met with sympathy, with a public instinct to separate the child from the parent, to say that she could not be blamed for a father she had barely known. Princess Michael was met instead with something closer to grim satisfaction, a sense in some quarters that the mask had slipped and the truth had come out, that the pushy foreign princess had been exposed as something darker still. The prejudice that had greeted her arrival shaped the reception of the scandal. She was punished not only for her father's past, but for her own unpopularity, and the two fed each other. It would not be the last time. We are about halfway through the story now, and the picture is starting to darken from all sides. If you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. So take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications, and it makes sure the second half finds its way to you. A quick tap of the like button genuinely helps as well. Now, with the war and the wedding and the first great scandal behind us, we turn to the accusations that were entirely her own, beginning with the one that painted her, more than any other, as a woman on the take. Money was the accusation that stuck to the Kents longest, and it stuck because it was true in outline, even where it was unfair in detail. The core fact was simple and, to a great many members of the public, indefensible. For years, the Prince and Princess of Kent lived in a large and gracious apartment inside Kensington Palace, one of the grandest addresses in London, while paying a rent so low that it amounted, in the eyes of critics, to a gift from the taxpayer. To understand why this became such a running sore, you have to understand what the couple were and were not. Prince Michael was a working member of the extended royal family in the loosest sense. He carried out some public engagements and represented certain causes, but he was not a frontline royal in the way his cousin the Queen, or her children, were frontline royals. Crucially, he did not draw an income from public funds for his royal work. He earned his living privately, through business and consultancy, which meant that in one respect he was less of a burden on the public purse than the senior royals who received official support. The couple were, by the standards of the family, not rich. There was no vast inherited fortune behind them. They lived, in large part, on what Prince Michael could earn. And yet there was the apartment. Housing in the royal palaces has long been allocated on what is called a grace and favour basis, meaning that residences are granted by the Crown to favoured individuals, often for little or no rent, as a kind of perk of proximity to the monarchy. It is an ancient arrangement, and it made a certain sense in an age when the people housed this way were courtiers and servants of the Crown whose work required them to be close at hand. Applied to a minor royal couple in the modern era, it looked very different. When it emerged that the Kents were occupying a substantial Kensington Palace apartment while paying a rent that was a small fraction of what such a property would command on the open market, the arrangement became a symbol of everything the public suspected about hangers-on living high at the public expense. The figures reported over the years, which deserve a careful check against the record before anyone repeats them as gospel, described a rent of only a modest sum per week for an apartment that would have fetched an enormous amount commercially. Members of Parliament raised the matter. The question of grace and favour housing, and of who was subsidising whom, became a recurring line of attack for those who wanted to question the cost of the monarchy. And the Kents, as the most prominent minor royals living this way, took the brunt of it. The image was devastatingly simple. A princess who was already cast as grasping, living in a palace, at a price ordinary people could only dream of, while claiming to be hard up. It confirmed everything. Eventually the arrangement changed. In time, the couple were reported to have moved on to a commercial rent, paying a market rate for their palace home, and there were reports that for a period, the cost was covered privately from within the royal family rather than by the public. The specifics shifted over the years and are worth verifying carefully. What did not shift was the reputation the whole episode had built. Once the public had decided that the Princess of Kent was living in luxury on the taxpayers' money, the later correction, the move to a proper rent, did nothing to undo the impression. It was the same pattern as everything else. The charge arrived loud and the remedy arrived quiet, and the loud version was the one that lasted. A fair reckoning has to hold two things at once here, because the rent story is a near-perfect example of how the truth about this woman sat in an uncomfortable middle. On one hand, the criticism had real force. There was something genuinely hard to defend about minor royals, doing limited public work, being housed so cheaply in one of the most valuable buildings in the country, and the anger it produced was not simply snobbery or prejudice, but a reasonable objection to a system that seemed to reward proximity to the crown with unearned comfort. On the other hand, the specific villainy laid at Princess Michael's door was overstated. She did not invent the grace and favour system. She did not set her own rent. The arrangement was the palace's, part of an old machinery of royal patronage that predated her by centuries, and she was, in that sense, a beneficiary of a system rather than the architect of a scam. The couple genuinely did lack the great wealth the public assumed all royals possessed. She was, once again, guilty of something real and blamed for something larger, cast as the grasping author of an arrangement she had merely inherited. The system was the scandal. She was the face they put on it. Somewhere in the middle of the caricature, almost buried under the nicknames and the scandals, there is a fact about Princess Michael of Kent that sits oddly with all the rest, and it deserves its own chapter because it complicates the picture in a way the tabloids never wanted to admit. She was a working writer, not a royal who lent her name to a ghost-written memoir, and not a dabbler who produced one vanity volume for the coffee table. She built a genuine second career as an author, first of popular history and later of historical fiction, sustained across decades, with real research behind it and real sales in front of it. Her subject, unsurprisingly, was the world she knew best and had been shaped by, the royalty of Europe and the women who lived at the edges of its power. Her first major book, published in the middle of the 1980s, examined the lives of princesses who had married into foreign courts and had to make their way as strangers in strange lands, a subject on which she was, whatever else you thought of her, an authentic expert. She had lived it. Later she turned to historical fiction, producing novels set among the courts and the powerful women of medieval and Renaissance France, including a trilogy centered on the formidable figures of the House of Anjou. She did her own research. She knew the material. And she wrote a good deal of it, steadily, over many years, which is not the behavior of a poser, but of someone who actually wanted to write. This matters because it cuts directly against the laziest version of the Princess Michael story, the version in which she is nothing but a grasping social climber who married a title and then lived off it. A woman who spends decades researching and writing books about 15th-century French noblewomen is doing something that the grasping social climber of the caricature would never bother to do. It is slow, solitary, unglamorous work, and it brings little of the reflected celebrity that the caricature says she craved. She did it anyway, which tells you that there was more to her than the label allowed, an intelligence and a discipline and a genuine intellectual life that the public was never encouraged to see because it did not fit the story that sold papers. And yet even here, even in the one arena where she was demonstrably doing serious and legitimate work, the shadow followed her. Her first history book drew public accusations that some of its passages sat too close to the earlier writing of other authors, a charge of borrowing that in the literary world carries real weight. She disputed the accusation. Her defenders framed any similarities as a matter of imperfect attribution rather than deliberate theft, the kind of sourcing lapse that has entangled many popular historians who work with the same well-trodden material. Whether the criticism was fair in its particulars is a question for those who compared the texts. What is undeniable is how perfectly the accusation fit the frame that had already been built around her. Because think about what the charge was, at its heart. It was that she had taken something that belonged to someone else and passed it off as her own. That is the exact accusation that the whole Princess Pushy legend was built on, transposed from the drawing room to the page. She was the outsider who had taken a title that was not hers by birth, taken a place in a family that did not want her, and now, said the critics, taken words that were not hers by right. The plagiarism accusation was not just a literary dispute, it was the master narrative of her entire public life, appearing again in a new costume, and it landed with such force precisely because the public had been primed for decades to believe that taking what was not hers was simply what this woman did. A more welcome figure might have been given the benefit of the doubt, the assumption of an honest mistake. She was given the assumption of guilt, because the story of her guilt had already been written, and every new episode was read as another chapter of it, rather than judged on its own. The writing life, then, is the part of the story where you can see the machinery of her reputation working most clearly. Here was a genuine achievement, real books, real work, real expertise, and even it was turned against her, folded into the legend of the woman who took what was not hers. The accomplishment was ignored, and the accusation was amplified. It is a small case study in how a fixed reputation devours everything it touches, converting even the evidence of a person's virtues into further evidence of their supposed vice. She wrote serious books for decades. The public remembered the plagiarism headline. That, in miniature, is the whole tragedy of how she was seen. If the SS revelation was the scandal she could most fairly be excused from, the New York incident was the one that did her the most lasting damage among ordinary people, because it was not about her father or her finances or a system she had inherited. It was about her own words, her own conduct, and it touched the rawest nerve in modern public life. In the spring of 2004, it was reported that during a dinner at a fashionable restaurant in Manhattan, Princess Michael had told a group of black diners at a nearby table, in substance, to go back to the colonies. The account that reached the press held that the diners had been talking or laughing, that the princess had objected to the noise, and that in the course of the exchange, she had used words that were unmistakably racial, invoking the colonies in a way that could only be read as telling black people they did not belong. The alleged remark spread with the speed that such things always travel, and it did so in a country and a moment acutely attuned to exactly this kind of insult. Within hours, the story was everywhere, and the words attributed to her were doing their work, seeming to confirm, from her own mouth, the racial insensitivity that had long been whispered around her. She denied it, and she denied it firmly. Her account of the evening was different from the one that had been reported. She insisted that she had not said what was attributed to her, that the reported quote was false, and that the exchange had not been what her accusers described. She did not accept that she had told anyone to go back anywhere, and she rejected the characterization of the encounter as a racist outburst. The dispute, in the end, came down to two irreconcilable versions of a brief moment in a noisy restaurant, with no recording and no neutral witness to settle which was true. That irresolution is the heart of the matter, and honesty requires sitting in it rather than pretending it away. We do not know, with certainty, what was said in that restaurant. The allegation was serious, specific, and damaging. The denial was firm, consistent, and equally impossible to disprove. A fair mind has to hold the accusation as unproven, because that is what it is. And yet the damage did not wait for proof, and it was never going to, because the allegation did not need to be proven to be believed. It only needed to fit, and it fit perfectly. The public had spent more than 20 years being told that Princess Michael was a grand, imperious, possibly bigoted outsider, and here was a story that matched that portrait in every particular. The frame did the work that evidence could not. People believed it because they had already been prepared to believe it, and her denial, however sincere, was pushing against 2 decades of accumulated expectation. There is a hard lesson buried in the New York affair, and it is not a comfortable one for anyone who cares about fairness. A reputation, once fixed, becomes a kind of judge that hears every new case with its verdict already decided. Princess Michael had, by 2004, been so thoroughly cast as the villain of her own story that an unproven allegation could convict her in the public mind as surely as a confession. That is a genuine injustice, if she was innocent, and it is impossible to say with certainty that she was not. But it is also, in part, an injustice she had helped to build, because a person who has spent decades cultivating grandeur and standing on rank has, whether fairly or not, made herself into exactly the sort of figure such an allegation will stick to. The tragedy of the New York incident is that it cannot be resolved. She may have been wronged, she may have been caught. The only thing that can be said for certain is that by the time it happened, the truth had almost stopped mattering, because the verdict was already in. 13 years later came the moment this whole story opened on, and by the time it arrived, it played out less like a fresh scandal than like the final scene of a play whose ending everyone already knew. In December of 2017, at the Queen's Christmas lunch inside Buckingham Palace, Princess Michael of Kent wore a brooch in the style known as blackamoor, depicting the head and torso of a black African figure, to a gathering at which Meghan Markle, newly engaged to Prince Harry, was among the guests. The symbolism was so stark that it barely needed narrating. Here was a woman with a decades-long reputation for racial insensitivity, real or alleged, wearing an image many people regard as a relic of a racist past, to one of the first family occasions attended by the woman who was about to become the royal family's first member of mixed heritage. The photographs went everywhere. The outrage was immediate, and the apology followed with the speed of an institution that had done this many times before. Her office said that the brooch had been a gift, that she had worn it on other occasions without incident, that she was very sorry and very distressed that it had caused offense, and that she would not wear it again. To understand why the brooch caused what it caused, it helps to understand what a blackamoor actually is. It is a genre of European decorative art, jewelry, sculpture, ornament, going back centuries, depicting black Africans, usually in exoticized and idealized forms, often as servants or attendants, rendered in precious materials. In its own time, it was regarded as fashionable and even as a form of flattery. In ours, it is widely seen, and with good reason, as a product of exactly the imperial and racial attitudes that treated black people as ornamental objects rather than as full human beings. To a modern eye, and especially to a black person confronted with it, the blackamoor is not a neutral antique. It is a small monument to a way of seeing that caused immense harm. Wearing one to a royal lunch in the 21st century was, at the very least, a profound failure to read the moment. So was it deliberate? That is the question everyone asked, and it is worth taking seriously, rather than simply assuming the worst. On one reading, the most damning, it was a pointed act, a woman with known views, making a statement to a family member she resented. On another reading, gentler and in some ways more plausible, it was thoughtlessness rather than malice. An older woman reaching for a favorite and expensive piece of jewelry from her own collection, a piece she had worn before without controversy, without stopping to consider how it would look to the newest and most scrutinized member of the family. The apology, with its emphasis on the brooch as a gift worn many times before, leaned hard on the second reading. Her long record of alleged insensitivity leaned hard on the first. And the public, once again, chose the reading that matched the reputation, because the reputation was all it had ever been given. The most revealing part of the brooch affair, though, is not the brooch itself, but what happened around it, or rather what did not. The apology came from her own office, not from the palace. There was no public reprimand from on high, no formal institutional consequence, no signal from the family that she had been called to account. The machine did what the machine always did. It let her issue her own apology, it let the story run its course, and it absorbed the embarrassment without ever visibly acting against her. She wore an offensive image to the Queen's own lunch, in front of the woman about to marry the Queen's grandson, and the institutional response was, in effect, silence and endurance. That silence is the whole thesis of this story, in a single gesture. The palace knew, as it had always known, that this was a woman who generated exactly this kind of trouble. And the palace decided, as it had always decided, that knowing was one thing, and acting was another, and that it would go on quietly absorbing her, rather than ever openly confronting her. The brooch was not really a new chapter. It was the same chapter it had always been, worn, this time, on the lapel. For all the years that the newspapers spent building their case against Princess Michael, there is a fact about the Kent marriage that the case tends to leave out, and it is a fact that ought to be set squarely beside all the rest. The reputation for causing the royal family embarrassment was never hers alone. Her husband, the quiet soldier scholar who looked like a murdered tsar, produced, late in his life, a public humiliation of his own that was in some ways more serious than anything his wife had ever been accused of, because it went to the heart of what a royal is and is not permitted to sell. The trouble grew out of the very thing that had always defined him, his lifelong connection to Russia. Prince Michael's fascination with the country of his Romanov ancestors was genuine and long-standing, but it was not only a matter of history and sentiment. Over the years he had built real business interests connected to Russia, trading, in effect, on his name, his royal standing, and his access. This was not illegal, and members of the extended royal family, who receive no public money, have to earn a living somehow. But it placed him in a grey and dangerous zone, where the value he offered to a business partner was, unavoidably, the royal prestige and the doors that prestige could open. When your commercial worth is your closeness to the crown, the line between honest work and the sale of royal influence becomes very thin and very easy to cross without meaning to. In the spring of 2021, that line was tested in the most public way imaginable. A British television investigation, working together with a Sunday newspaper, set a trap. Undercover reporters posed as representatives of a company they had invented, presenting themselves as a South Korean gold investment business looking for prestige and access. They approached Prince Michael and an associate of his, and they filmed what followed. On camera, the associate spoke of the prince in terms that suggested his name, and his connections in Russia could be engaged for a fee, and the prince himself appeared willing to lend his royal standing to the supposed company, to make a paid appearance on its behalf, and to be presented to potential investors as a figure who could open Russian doors. The company was fictional. The willingness, on camera, looked real. When the story was published, it was acutely embarrassing, and not only for the prince. Here was a working member of the extended royal family, a cousin of the Queen, filmed apparently offering to trade on his royal status and his Russian access for commercial gain, at a moment when relations between Britain and Russia were deeply strained. Prince Michael denied any wrongdoing. His office made clear that he had no special or current relationship with the Russian leadership, that he had not had contact with the Russian president for many years, and that he had done nothing improper. His associate expressed regret for any embarrassment caused. The prince's defenders pointed out, correctly, that being caught on camera in a sting engineered by journalists is not the same as being caught in an actual crime, and that no wrongdoing was ever established. But the damage, as ever in these stories, did not depend on wrongdoing being established. The footage existed, the image was fixed. A senior member of the wider royal family had been filmed seeming to put the family name up for hire, and no denial could unsee it. The point for our story is not to weigh the precise degree of the prince's culpability, which was contested and never resolved into any formal finding. The point is simpler and more important. The couple that the establishment kept quietly at arm's length, absorbing scandal after scandal for decade after decade, was a couple, and both halves of it generated the trouble. The narrative had spent 40 years pointing at the foreign wife as the source of all the difficulty, the pushy outsider who kept dragging the family into the papers. And then, near the end, the English-born prince, the blood royal, the grandson of a king, produced a scandal of his own that showed the discomfort had never been coming from one side of that marriage. It had been coming from both. She had simply been the one it was easier and more satisfying to blame. The legend of Princess Michael always cast her marriage in a particular way, and it was a way that flattered the prince and damned the wife. In that telling, she was the predator and he was the prey, a scheming, ambitious outsider who had set her sights on a naive and gentle prince and captured him, dragging a decent man into a lifetime of trouble he would never have found on his own. It is a satisfying story, and it fits the villain the machine had built. It is also, on the evidence of the marriage itself, almost entirely false, and the truth of what the two of them actually were together is far more interesting than the fiction. What they were was a partnership of two marginal people, and the marginality is the key to it. He was inside the family and outside its center, a posthumous younger son of a younger son, royal by blood and peripheral by every other measure, a serious man in a role that offered him almost nothing serious to do. She was outside the family altogether, a dispossessed foreign aristocrat who had clawed her way to its edge and was never going to be let past the threshold. Neither of them stood anywhere near the heart of the institution. Both of them, in different ways, lived at its margin, close enough to feel the warmth of the center and far enough never to sit in it. When two people like that find each other, the bond between them is not conquest, it is recognition. Each saw in the other someone who understood, from the inside, what it was to be near the great machine of monarchy and never quite of it. And that shared condition was the ground their marriage grew on. There was a practical dimension to the partnership that set them apart from almost everyone else in the family, and it bound them together in a way outsiders rarely appreciated. They had to earn a living. This is the thing that is so easily forgotten about the Kents, because the public assumes that all royals are simply rich, carried through life on inherited fortunes and public money. They were not. Prince Michael received no income from public funds for his royal work. He supported himself and his family through his own business activities, the consultancy and the commercial ventures that traded, unavoidably, on his name and his connections, and that would eventually land him in the Russian embarrassment we have already examined. She, for her part, worked too, at her interior design in the early years, and then at her writing across the decades, producing a real body of books that sold in real numbers. Here was a royal couple engaged in the entirely unroyal project of making their own way, of covering their own costs, of building a life on what they could themselves earn, rather than on what the state or an inheritance provided. That shared enterprise, the ordinary business of two people working to sustain the life they had chosen, was a bond that most royal marriages never have to form, because most royal couples never have to worry about the money at all. They operated as well as a working royal couple in the public sense, undertaking the patronages and the engagements and the representative duties that were open to figures of their rank. They lent themselves to causes, they turned up, they did the unglamorous ceremonial labor of the monarchy's outer ranks, the ribbon cuttings and the receptions and the charitable appearances that fill a royal diary and never make the news. Two people at the edge of the family, quietly doing the edge of the family's work, year after year, as a pair. It is not a dramatic picture, it is the true one, and it is the picture the legend of the scheming wife and the captured prince could never accommodate, because there is nothing predatory in a couple simply getting on with the ordinary duties of a shared life. None of this is to romanticize the marriage into something it was not, and honesty requires the same balance here that it has required everywhere else in this account. A long marriage under extraordinary pressure is never a simple thing, and over the decades there were reports of strain between them, of a couple who at times pursued separate interests and lived, in some measure, separate lives. The ordinary distances that open up in any long union, and that the peculiar pressures of royal life could only widen. No one outside a marriage can map its inner weather, and it would be false to paint the Kent marriage as an unbroken idyll. But the strains, whatever they were, did not break it. Through the SS revelation, through the money scandals, through New York and the brooch, through his own Russian humiliation, through 4 decades of a press campaign aimed with special venom at the wife, the two of them held together, defending, in the end, a shared life that belonged to both of them and that neither chose to abandon. That endurance is the final answer to the predator and prey legend, and it is a complete one. A man who has been captured, trapped, dragged unwillingly into a marriage he regrets, does not remain in it, faithfully and by choice, for the better part of half a century. He leaves, or he is at least visibly miserable, and he takes, at some point, one of the many opportunities that a man of his position and his grievances would have had to escape. Prince Michael did none of that. He stayed, through everything, married to the woman the whole world was inviting him to resent, and his staying is the plainest possible statement that the marriage was not the trap of the legend, but a genuine partnership he valued enough to keep. The prey does not spend 40 years defending the predator. The two of them defended each other and a shared life against a world that had decided one of them was a villain, and that mutual defense, sustained across decades, is the truest thing that can be said about what they were to one another. So set the legend aside, because the marriage refutes it. She did not capture him. They found each other, two intelligent and solitary people at the margin of the same institution, and they built together the ordinary, working, enduring partnership that two such people build, complete with its labors and its strains and its long, quiet loyalty. It was not a fairy tale, and it was not a crime. It was a marriage, a real one, and the fact that the public was never allowed to see it as such, was handed instead the cartoon of the scheming outsider and her hapless prince, is one more item on the long list of things about this woman that the machine got wrong. There is a test that quietly cuts through a great deal of the noise around Princess Michael of Kent, and it is a test the caricature consistently fails. If she was truly the monster the legend describes, cold, cruel, impossible, a nasty piece of work in the fullest sense of the phrase, then the two people best placed to know it, and least able to escape it, would be her own children. And the striking thing about her children is how unremarkable, in the best sense, their lives turned out to be. She had two, born in the first years of the marriage, a son and a daughter. In keeping with the bargain struck before the wedding, the price she had paid for marrying into a Protestant royal house, they were raised in the Church of England, rather than in their mother's Catholic faith. They grew up as members of the extended royal family, carrying courtesy titles, present at the edges of the great family occasions, and they grew up, by and large, without becoming disasters. They did not spiral into the kind of very public ruin that has claimed other children of the wider royal circle. They were educated, they built their own working lives, they married, and they made their way into adulthood as reasonably grounded people, rather than as cautionary tales. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, a great deal, and it is the kind of evidence the legend has no room for. Raising children who turn out steady is difficult under any circumstances. Raising them steady inside the pressure cooker of royal life, under constant press scrutiny, as the offspring of the most mocked woman in the family, is harder still. Whatever Princess Michael was in the drawing rooms of her critics, in the one place that matters most, the raising of her own children, she appears to have done a competent and even a loving job, because the results speak for a mother who gave her children something solid to stand on. A genuinely cruel and chaotic woman does not, as a rule, produce children who grow up quietly well. The caricature and the outcome do not fit together, and when a caricature and an outcome do not fit, it is usually the caricature that is wrong. Then there is the marriage itself, which endured for a length of time that most marriages, royal or otherwise, do not achieve. She and Prince Michael stayed married across the decades, through every scandal that battered them, his and hers alike. This is not to paint the union as a fairy tale, and honesty requires acknowledging that over the years there were reports of strain, of a couple who pursued separate interests and lived, at times, somewhat separate lives, the ordinary frictions and distances of a long marriage under extraordinary pressure. No one outside a marriage can truly know its inner weather, and it would be false to pretend the Kent marriage was untroubled. But it held, through the SS revelation, through the money scandals, through New York and the brooch, through his own Russian humiliation, through 40 years of tabloid hostility, aimed with special venom at the wife, the two of them remained together. That endurance is itself a kind of answer to the caricature. The woman the world was invited to see as impossible to like, proved entirely possible to stay married to, for a very long time, by a man who had every opportunity and every excuse to leave, and never took it. What the children and the marriage reveal, taken together, is the gap between the public woman and the private one. The public Princess Michael was the sum of her scandals, a figure assembled from headlines, each new episode confirming the last. The private Princess Michael, glimpsed only indirectly through the lives of the people closest to her, seems to have been something the headlines never captured, a mother who raised steady children and a wife who held a difficult marriage together across half a lifetime. Neither picture is the whole truth, but the private one, quiet and undramatic, and therefore invisible to the press, has a claim on our attention precisely because it was never performed for anyone. Nobody builds a decades-long marriage and a pair of grounded children as a publicity exercise. Those are the things a person does when no one is watching, and they are, for that reason, better evidence of who she really was than anything she ever wore, said, or was accused of in the glare. For all the noise, most of Princess Michael's actual life was quiet, and almost none of the quiet was ever reported, because quiet does not sell newspapers. Between the scandals that made her famous, there stretched decades of the ordinary, unglamorous business that fills the days of a working member of the wider royal family, and it is worth spending a little time there, because it is the part of her the public was never shown, and therefore never counted in its verdict. Like others in her position, she attached her name and her time to a range of charitable and cultural causes, the sort of patronages that make up the everyday portfolio of a royal life. Organizations devoted to the arts, to music, to the welfare of animals, and to the care of the sick and the dying, could call on a royal patron to lend visibility to their work, to attend an event, to draw a little attention and a little money toward a cause that needed both. This is the quiet machinery of royal charity, and it is real work, even if it is undramatic. A patron who turns up, who takes an interest, who lends a name that opens doors and loosens purse strings, is doing something of genuine value to the people on the other end of it, and the fact that it never makes the front page does not make it less real. Anyone who wishes to name the specific bodies she supported should check the record carefully, because the details deserve accuracy, but the shape of the thing is not in doubt. She did the ordinary work of a royal patron, year after year, and it went almost entirely unremarked. Her cultural interests were not a pose adopted for these duties. They were genuine, and they ran deep, which set her apart from the many public figures who lend their names to the arts without knowing or caring much about them. She was, as we have seen, a serious student of history and a working writer, immersed in the world of European courts, and the women who moved through them. She knew music and painting and the decorative arts, the fruit of an education designed to produce exactly that kind of cultivation, and of a mind that had actually absorbed it. In a family not always famous for its intellectual appetites, she was a woman of real learning, at home in galleries and libraries and concert halls, and much of her private life was spent in the company of the books and the objects and the ideas she loved. That side of her, the scholar and the aesthete, was as authentic as any part of her, and it almost never reached the public, because a princess quietly reading about 15th century France is not a story, and a princess wearing the wrong brooch is. There is a deeper point buried in this quiet, and it goes to the very mechanics of how she was seen. The life of any public figure is overwhelmingly made up of the unremarkable, the ordinary days, the routine duties, the private interests, the small kindnesses, and the ordinary work that never generate a headline. The scandals, by contrast, are rare, but they are loud, and loudness is what survives. So the public portrait of a person like Princess Markle becomes wildly distorted, assembled almost entirely from the handful of dramatic episodes that made news, and containing almost nothing of the decades of ordinary life in between. The result is a figure who seems to be nothing but her scandals, because her scandals are the only part of her that was ever reported. The quiet good, the routine duty, the genuine learning, the ordinary days, all of it vanishes from the record, not because it did not happen, but because it did not sell. What the public was given was not a portrait of a life, it was a highlight reel of a life's worst moments, presented as though it were the whole. This is why the woman behind the headlines is so hard to see, and so important to insist on. She was not, in the ordinary running of her days, a scandal. She was a patron who turned up for her causes, a scholar who buried herself in her subjects, a writer who worked steadily at her books, a mother who raised her children, a wife who kept her marriage. The scandals were real, and this account has not flinched from them. But they were also rare, punctuation marks in a life that was mostly made of the same undramatic substance as anyone else's, and the failure to see that, the reduction of a whole complicated human being to a short list of her worst days, is not a small injustice. It is the central one. Nobody is the sum of their headlines, but headlines were nearly all that Princess Markle of Kent was ever allowed to be. There is a woman whose story rhymes with Princess Markle's so closely that the two of them ended up in the same photograph, at the same lunch, on the day of the brooch, and the rhyme is worth drawing out, because it shows both how little and how much had changed across a single generation. That woman is Meghan Markle. Set the two of them side by side, and the parallels are almost uncanny. Both were outsiders who married into the British royal family from beyond its usual circles. Both were foreign-born, one from Central Europe, one from America. Both arrived carrying things the institution had historically found difficult, and both were met, sooner or later, with the same essential accusation, that they were difficult, demanding, grand, that they did not know their place, that they were, in the oldest and ugliest phrasing, a nasty piece of work. The nickname that greeted one was Princess Pushy. The characterization that pursued the other, across a great many stories, was almost identical in substance, if not in exact words. Two outsider women, separated by decades, were handed the same script, cast in the same role, and told to play the same part. The interloper who did not belong and would not behave. The racial dimension is where the parallel turns sharpest, and where the brooch becomes almost unbearably pointed. Meghan Markle was the first member of the modern royal family of visibly mixed heritage, and questions of race were, unavoidably, part of her story from the start. Princess Markle's difficulties had run along a different axis, the axis of foreignness, class, and religion rather than race, but her own record where race was concerned, real or alleged, was long and damaging, from the New York restaurant to the blackamoor brooch itself. And so, on that December afternoon in 2017, the two stories collided in a single image. The older outsider, with her history of racial controversy, wearing a racially charged ornament to a lunch attended by the newer outsider, for whom race was central. The earlier scapegoat, in effect, stood at the boundary of the family and confronted the next arrival with a symbol of exactly the exclusion she herself had suffered in a different form. It is one of the strangest and most telling tableaus in the recent history of the monarchy, the outsider serving as the enforcer of the line against the next outsider, and it happened because both women were caught in the same ancient machinery, made to play roles the institution had been assigning for centuries. But here is where the generation between them matters, and where the change, when it finally came, becomes visible. When Princess Markle was cast as the difficult outsider in the 1980s and 1990s, there was almost no pushback. The press coined the nickname, and the public accepted it, and the idea that the treatment of her might itself be unjust, might be driven by prejudice against a foreign, Catholic, self-made woman, was barely raised at all. She was condemned, and the condemnation went largely unquestioned, because the assumptions underneath it, that outsiders were suspect and that the establishment's judgment was sound, were still broadly shared. When Meghan Markle was cast in the same role, a generation later, something different happened. A very large part of the public, and a significant part of the media, pushed back hard. They questioned the fairness of the coverage. They asked whether the hostility directed at her was really about her conduct or about who she was. They named the possibility of prejudice out loud, and they refused to simply accept the establishment's verdict. The role was the same. The reception of the role had changed. That difference is the measure of a shift in the ground beneath the whole institution, and it casts a long, retrospective light back onto Princess Markle. The questions that were finally asked on Meghan Markle's behalf: is this fair? Is this prejudice? Is the outsider being punished for existing rather than for acting? Were exactly the questions that were almost never asked on Princess Markle's behalf a generation earlier. She was condemned in an age that did not think to interrogate its own condemnation. She had the misfortune to be the outsider of an earlier era, judged by a public that still trusted the judgment, before the culture developed the reflex to ask whether the machinery grinding down the newcomer might itself be the thing at fault. Had she arrived 30 years later, some of the hostility she faced might have met the same skepticism that greeted the campaign against her successor. She arrived too early for that mercy. None of this collapses the two women into one, or pretends their cases were identical, because they were not, and each deserves to be judged on her own facts rather than folded into the other. It is to say that the parallel exposes the pattern, and the pattern is the point. The institution has a role it assigns to the outsider woman who does not fit, and it has assigned that role, with remarkable consistency, across generations and across very different individuals. Wallace Simpson played it. Princess Markle played it. Meghan Markle played it. The players changed, the part did not. And the only thing that shifted, slowly, across the decades, was the willingness of the watching public to ask whether the part was a fair one to make anybody play. Princess Markle lived, and was judged, before that question was widely asked. That, as much as anything, is why her verdict was so harsh, and why it went unchallenged for so long. To understand how a reputation like hers gets built and kept, you have to understand that it was not the work of any single person or any single decision. It was the product of a machine, a system of press, public appetite, and institutional silence that took a real and flawed woman as its raw material and manufactured from her a reliable, marketable villain, and then kept the production line running for 40 years. Begin with the economics, because they are the engine of the whole thing. A newspaper exists to be bought, and certain stories sell better than others, and few stories sell as reliably as a royal one with a clear villain in it. Princess Markle was, from the tabloid point of view, a gift. She was royal, which guaranteed attention. She was foreign and grand and unliked, which meant readers were happy to see her taken down. And she could be relied upon, over the years, to supply fresh material, a comment, an incident, a scandal, a brooch. A figure like that is not merely a subject for the press. She is an asset. She moves papers, and an asset that moves papers is not one the press has any interest in treating fairly, because fairness is not what sells. Villainy sells. So the incentive, built into the very economics of the coverage, was to cast her as the villain, and to keep casting her that way, because every story that confirmed the legend was a story that sold, and every story that complicated it was a story that did not. Then add the mechanism by which a reputation, once established, sustains itself, because this is the part that makes such legends so hard to escape. The first stories create a frame, an idea of who the person is, and every subsequent story is then written and read through that frame. Once the public has decided that Princess Markle is grand, grasping, and insensitive, a new incident is not reported as an isolated event to be judged on its merits. It is reported as the latest confirmation of what everyone already knows, another chapter in an established story. The frame selects which facts count. Behavior that fits the legend is highlighted. Because it is news, it confirms the narrative, it sells. Behavior that contradicts the legend is ignored. Because it is not news, it muddies the narrative, it does not sell. Over time, this produces a portrait of relentless consistency, a woman who appears to do nothing but confirm her own reputation, when in truth, the reputation has simply been filtering the evidence, keeping everything that fit and discarding everything that did not. The consistency is an artifact of the filter, not a fact about the woman. The nickname was the perfect instrument of this machine, because a nickname is a brand, and a brand is a frame you can carry in a single word. Princess Pushy was not a description, it was a product, a compact, memorable, endlessly repeatable label that prejudged everything she did before she did it. Every time it appeared in print, it reactivated the whole legend in the reader's mind, saved the writer the trouble of making any actual case, and sold the story on the strength of a reputation the word itself sustained. A brand that good is commercially far too valuable to retire, and so it was not retired. It followed her for decades, doing its work in a syllable, a permanent advertisement for a version of her that the machine had every financial reason to keep alive. And now add the final, quietest input, the one this whole account keeps returning to, because without it, the machine could not have run so smoothly for so long. The palace's silence. The press could manufacture the villain, and the public could buy her, but the institution could, at any point, have interfered with the production, could have folded her more warmly into the family's public life, could have signaled that she was valued and protected, could have made the cost of attacking her higher and the story of her villainy harder to sustain. It largely did not. Its silence was not neutral. In the economy of reputation, the refusal of the most powerful institution in the picture to defend one of its own members functions as a kind of permission, a signal that she is fair game, that no one important will object, that the production can continue without consequence. The palace did not write the stories. But by declining, for 40 years, to stand behind her, it removed the one countervailing force that might have slowed the machine and left her exposed to it, alone. Put the inputs together, and you have a closed and self-sustaining system, one that needed her to be a villain and therefore made sure she remained one. The press had a commercial interest in the legend and manufactured it. The public had an appetite for the legend and consumed it. The reputation, once built, filtered all new evidence to confirm itself. The nickname branded the whole thing into a single word, and the palace's silence removed the only break. A real, flawed, complicated woman went in one end of this machine, and out the other end came a cartoon, a nasty piece of work, a figure of settled and unquestioned villainy, and the distance between the woman and the cartoon was the exact measure of what the machine had added. She gave it real material to work with, and this account has never denied it. But the finished product, the monster of the legend, was not simply her. It was her, multiplied by a system that profited from her villainy and an institution that would not lift a finger to defend her, and the result was a reputation that no amount of quiet decency in her private life could ever hope to outrun. Everything in this story finally comes back to a single, quiet, institutional fact. The fact the title points at. The palace knew. It knew from the beginning that Princess Markle of Kent was the wrong kind of match. A Catholic divorcee foreigner marrying a cousin of the Queen through a side door in a foreign register office. It knew, when the nickname took hold, that she was being cast as the pushy outsider and did little to lift the label. It knew, in 1985, that her father had an SS past, and it kept her. It knew about the money and the palace apartment, and it let the arrangement run for years. It knew about New York, and the brooch, and the whole long pattern of a woman who generated exactly this kind of trouble. None of it was a secret to the people who ran the royal household, and across 4 decades, knowing all of it, The institution made the same choice over and over again. It kept her close, it never defended her warmly, and it never cut her loose. It absorbed her. To see how deliberate that choice was, you have to see it against the alternatives, because the British monarchy has a long and well-practiced repertoire for dealing with the people who embarrass it, and expulsion is very much part of the repertoire. This is an institution that knows how to remove a problem when it decides the problem has become too dangerous to keep. Consider the greatest royal scandal of the 20th century, the one that hung over the whole of Princess Markle's era. When King Edward VIII chose to marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson in 1936, the establishment did not absorb him. It maneuvered him off the throne and out of the country, and once he was gone, it kept him at a permanent, carefully managed distance, denying his wife the style of Royal Highness, and ensuring that the couple lived out their lives as exiles, supported but never welcomed home. That was the institution acting openly against one of its own, because it had decided that the threat, a king determined to marry a woman it found unacceptable, was existential. When the monarchy judges that the danger is great enough, it does not hesitate. It removes. Consider Princess Margaret, the Queen's own sister, whose love for the divorced group captain Peter Townsend in the 1950s ran headlong into the same establishment machinery. She was not allowed to marry him, steered away from the match by the combined weight of church, government, and family, and when her later marriage to Lord Snowdon collapsed in public, she was contained and managed and kept, a difficult, wounded figure held firmly inside the family fold. That was the institution protecting an insider, absorbing her troubles because she was, unquestionably, one of them, the sovereign's sister, blood of the blood. Consider Sarah Ferguson, who married Prince Andrew, embarrassed the family through a series of very public scandals, and was, after her divorce, pushed steadily to the margins, tolerated at the edges as the mother of two princesses, but never restored to the center. That was the institution managing an in-law it had come to regret, keeping her at a careful distance without ever quite expelling her, because she was the mother of royal children and there was nowhere clean to put her. And consider, in the end, Prince Andrew himself, whose association with the financier Jeffrey Epstein, and whose disastrous attempts to explain it, eventually produced a scandal so toxic that the institution did the thing it does only when it has run out of other options. It acted, openly and decisively, stripping him of his public role, his patronages, and his military affiliations, cutting a son of the Queen loose from the working monarchy because the damage had finally crossed the line from embarrassing to unsurvivable. That was the machine reaching, at last, for the ultimate sanction against one of its own, and it shows that no berth is high enough to guarantee protection once the threat becomes existential. Now set Princess Markle against that spectrum, and her whole strange position comes into focus. She was never expelled like Edward, never protected like Margaret, never quite pushed out like Fergie, never openly sanctioned like Andrew. She occupied a fifth category, the one the institution reserves for the embarrassment that never rises to the level of an existential threat. She was minor. Her scandals, for all their noise, never endangered the throne or the core of the monarchy in the way the abdication had, or the way the Epstein affair did. She was an irritant, not a danger, and so the institution did with her what it does with a manageable, permanent irritant. It managed her, permanently. It kept her housed, kept her on the tree, kept her at the Christmas lunch, and simply absorbed each new headline as it came, because keeping her was less trouble than the drama of getting rid of her would have been. She was never important enough to protect, and never dangerous enough to expel, and so she was held, forever, in the in-between. This is the deepest and least flattering truth about how the monarchy treated her, and it is a truth about the institution as much as about the woman. The palace's coldness toward Princess Markle was not principled. It was not that the family held her to some high standard of conduct that she repeatedly failed. If conduct were the measure, the family had insiders whose conduct was far worse, and who were shielded far better. The difference was never really about behavior, it was about belonging. The insiders, however they behaved, belonged, and the machine protected its own. The outsider, however she behaved, did not belong, and the machine extended her neither the warmth of protection nor the mercy of a clean break. It simply used her, in a sense, as a place to store an embarrassment it could not be bothered to resolve, keeping her close because that was convenient, and keeping her cold because that was easy, and letting the world go on calling her a nasty piece of work, while the institution quietly declined to do anything about the woman it had chosen, again and again, to keep. So when people said she was a nasty piece of work, they were passing a verdict on her. The harder and more interesting verdict is the one that falls on the family that kept her anyway. Because the palace knew everything the public knew, and a great deal more, and its response, sustained across 40 years, was not to defend her, and not to remove her, but to hold her in a permanent, useful, deniable limbo, absorbing her scandals and withholding its warmth, treating a human being as a manageable liability on a very long lease. Whatever she was, that is what was done to her. And it tells you something about the machinery of monarchy that the newspapers, so busy with the woman, almost never thought to examine at all. Having laid out the charges and the pattern, fairness now demands the strongest possible statement of the case for the defense, because there is a real one, and it is a good deal more persuasive than 40 years of tabloid headlines would suggest. If you set aside the accumulated weight of the reputation and look again at the woman underneath, a very different figure comes into view, and the argument for her is worth making at full strength. Begin with where she started, because nothing in the case against her ever takes it seriously. She was born on the losing side of the worst war in history, into a family and a class that lost everything, the land, the country, the world that gave their names meaning, all of it gone before she was old enough to remember any of it. Her parents' marriage broke apart. Her father was largely absent and then dead, and he left her, as her only inheritance from him, a chain of noble names and a hidden shame she did not learn of until she was an adult. She was raised across countries, belonging nowhere, and she built her early adult life through her own effort, in a country that was not hers, in a language that was not her first, with no fortune behind her. Every bit of security she ever achieved, she achieved by climbing for it. And when such a person climbs hard and guards fiercely the little that she has, and insists on the rank that is the one thing the war did not take from her, that is not simple vanity, it is the logic of a survivor. The pushiness the nickname mocked was, at its root, the reflex of a woman who had learned that if she did not fight for her place, no one would give it to her. Now placed beside her, the woman she most resembles in the history of the modern monarchy, because the parallel is exact and it is devastating. Wallis Simpson, a foreign woman, twice divorced, who married into the very heart of the royal family and was cast, from the moment she arrived, as the villain, the interloper, the dangerous outsider who did not belong. The establishment closed against Wallis Simpson with a ferocity that had very little to do with anything she had personally done, and a great deal to do with what she represented: foreignness, divorce, the intrusion of the wrong sort of woman into the sacred center of the institution. History has been slowly revising its verdict on Wallis, recognizing how much of the hatred directed at her was really the establishment's horror at change wearing the mask of a personal vendetta. The case for Princess Michael is that she was Wallis Simpson's successor in exactly this role, the outsider woman onto whom an anxious establishment projected all its fears, punished less for her conduct than for her existence, for being foreign and Catholic and self-made and unashamed, in a place that wanted its royal women to be none of those things. The double standard runs through every single one of the charges, once you look for it. Grandeur and a demanding manner, forgiven entirely in the born royals who possessed them in abundance, were treated as damning evidence in her. A difficult temper, absorbed without comment when it belonged to an insider, was reported as scandal when it belonged to her. The family history of the war, which in her case meant a father's SS past she had never known, was hung around her neck, while the awkward and sometimes shameful histories of other great families were quietly left alone. The financial arrangement of the palace apartment, which she inherited rather than invented, was laid at her door as though she personally had picked the taxpayer's pocket. Even her one unambiguous achievement, a real career as a writer, was turned against her through a disputed accusation that fit the story of her guilt. At every turn, the same behavior that would have been excused or ignored in a favored insider was, in her, converted into proof of villainy. That is not the treatment of a person being fairly judged. That is the treatment of a person the verdict had already condemned. And then there is the evidence the case against her cannot explain away, the private evidence, the evidence of the life she lived when the cameras were off. She raised 2 children who grew up steady and undestroyed, which is not what monsters produce. She held a marriage together for 4 decades, through every storm, which is not what impossible women manage. She built, with real discipline, a body of serious written work, which is not what idle social climbers bother to do. The defense rests, in the end, on the gap between the woman the public was shown and the woman her own life reveals. The public woman was a collage of scandals, each one selected and amplified to confirm the last. The private woman was a mother, a wife, and a writer who did difficult things well and quietly over a very long time. The case for the defense is simply that the private woman has the better claim to be the real one, because she was never performed for anyone, and the things a person does when no one is applauding are the truest things about them. Put at its strongest, the defense is this. Princess Markle of Kent was not the author of a life of villainy. She was a displaced survivor of a destroyed world who fought her way into the most closed establishment in the country, and who was met there and hounded there, not chiefly for what she did but for what she was, a foreigner, a Catholic, a divorcee, a self-made woman, in a world that wanted none of those things at its center. She made mistakes, some of them real, but she was punished for all of them with an appetite reserved for outsiders, while the insiders around her made worse mistakes and were shielded. She was, on this reading, less a villain than a scapegoat, a convenient outsider onto whom an anxious institution and a hungry press could load every fear they could not name directly, kept close so the loading could continue, and kept cold so the loading would seem deserved. That is the case for the defense, and it is strong enough that no honest account of her can pretend it away. And yet, a defense this strong has an obligation to face its own weaknesses honestly, because a case that only presents one side is not a verdict but a brief. So before we reach any conclusion, the argument has to turn around and confront the other half of the truth, the half in which the woman was not only wronged, but was also, in ways that were entirely her own, genuinely at fault. The case for the defense is strong, and it is true, but it is not the whole truth, and a story that stopped there would be doing to the record the same thing the tabloids did, only in reverse, flattening a complicated woman into a single figure, this time a martyr instead of a monster. So the argument has to turn and face the other half honestly, because being a scapegoat and being genuinely difficult are not opposites. A person can be both at once, and the evidence suggests that Princess Markle of Kent was. Start with the sheer weight and consistency of the testimony, because this is the part the sympathetic reading has to reckon with and usually skips. The accounts of her as imperious, demanding, grand, and hard to deal with are not the invention of a single hostile newspaper. They accumulate across 4 decades, from many different sources, in many different contexts, from people with no connection to one another and no shared reason to lie. When a portrait is painted that consistently, by that many independent hands, over that long a period, the honest conclusion is not that everyone was equally prejudiced. It is that there was a real subject being painted. Prejudice can explain why her faults were reported more harshly than an insider's. It cannot conjure faults out of nothing across 40 years and 100 separate accounts. Where there is that much smoke, for that long, from that many directions, there was fire. She was, at least a good deal of the time, genuinely difficult, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Then there is the matter of agency, which the survivor framing tends to quietly dissolve. It is true that she came from loss, that she clawed her way up from nothing, that her hunger for status had roots in a real dispossession. All of that explains a great deal. But explanation is not the same as excuse, and a hard past does not hand a person a blank check for their conduct in the present. Plenty of people are displaced by war and loss, and do not spend their lives standing on ceremony and making life difficult for those around them. The origins give context to her behavior. They do not erase her responsibility for it. She was an intelligent, capable adult who made her own choices about how to carry herself and how to treat people, and where those choices were arrogant or unkind. The fact that she had suffered earlier in life does not unmake them. To grant her only victimhood is to deny her the agency that a full human being possesses, and she possessed it in abundance. And some of the scandals were, plainly, her own doing, owed to nobody else. The SS Revelation was her father's history, and not hers. Fair enough. The palace rent was a system she inherited, granted. But the brooch was her choice. Nobody made her wear it. Whatever the intent, deliberate insult, or sheer thoughtlessness, a woman with her long record of racial controversy, attending a lunch at which the family's first mixed heritage member was a guest, reached into her own jewelry box and pinned on an image of a black man rendered as an ornament. Even on the most generous reading, that is a catastrophic failure of judgment, and it was entirely self-inflicted. The same is true, if the allegation was accurate, of the New York remark, which if she said it was her mouth and her words and no one else's. A person is entitled to sympathy for the burdens she did not choose. She is still accountable for the conduct she did, and in the brooch above all, we see a woman who, after 4 decades of being told exactly how she was perceived, still could not or would not exercise the basic caution that her own reputation demanded. That is not the palace's fault, or the tabloid's fault, or her father's fault. That is hers. There is even a harder version of the case against her, and honesty requires stating it. It is possible that the establishment's coldness, while unjust in its double standards, was not entirely without cause. An institution is entitled to notice when a member repeatedly generates avoidable trouble, and to keep a certain distance from the source of it. If Princess Markle was in fact difficult and prone to lapses of judgment, then some of the wariness around her was not pure prejudice, but a rational response to a genuine liability. The unfairness lay not in the wariness itself, but in its selectivity, in the way the same institution extended warmth and cover to insiders who were every bit as difficult. She had a real case that she was treated worse than others who behaved as badly. She did not have a case that she behaved perfectly and was maligned for nothing. Both of those things are true, and the second one matters as much as the first. So the rebuttal to the defense is not that the defense was wrong, it is that the defense was incomplete. She was scapegoated, and she was also difficult. She was treated unfairly, and she also gave her critics real material to work with. She was punished for things that were not her fault, and she was also responsible for things that were. The two halves do not cancel out. They coexist, uncomfortably, in the same woman, and any verdict that erases either half in favor of the other is a verdict that has decided the answer before hearing the evidence. Which leaves us, at the end of all of it, with the hard work of holding both halves at once and asking what, in the final reckoning, we are actually left with. As the decades wore on, Princess Markle settled into a strange kind of permanence. She was never a frontline royal, never one of the working corps whose engagements filled the court circular, and as she aged, she drifted further from whatever spotlight she had once occupied, without ever leaving the stage entirely. She remained what she had always been, a fixture at the edges, present in the family photographs and the great occasions, part of the furniture of the monarchy, neither promoted nor removed. The woman who had fought her whole life to belong ended up belonging in the only way the institution would ever allow her to, permanently, marginally, and without warmth. There was a quiet vindication buried in the law, though it arrived without fanfare and changed little on the surface. When Parliament reformed the rules of royal succession in the 21st century, sweeping away the old bar on marrying a Roman Catholic, Prince Michael was restored to the line of succession he had given up in 1978 for the sake of marrying her. The transgression that had marked their marriage at the start, the Catholic wife who had cost a prince his place, was formally declared to have never really mattered. It was, in its way, a small official acknowledgement that the whole basis on which she had first been treated as the wrong sort of match had been an anachronism all along. But it came late, it came quietly, and it did nothing to soften the reputation that had hardened around her over the intervening decades. The law changed its mind, the public did not. The brooch, when it came in 2017, was the proof of that. Here she was, deep into her later years, long past the age when most public figures have been allowed to fade into a settled dignity, and a single piece of jewelry could still detonate the entire reputation in an afternoon, could still summon up the whole accumulated legend of the insensitive, imperious outsider, as fresh and as damning as it had been 30 years before. The reputation had not aged or mellowed or been forgotten. It had simply waited, fully loaded, for the next occasion to go off. That is what a fixed reputation does. It does not fade with time. It lies in wait. And yet the world around her was changing in ways that quietly reframed her whole story, even as her personal standing stayed frozen. The reassessment of Wallis Simpson gathered pace, as historians increasingly recognized how much of the venom directed at that earlier outsider woman had been the establishment's fear of change wearing a personal mask. The arrival of Meghan Markle in the family, and the enormous public conversation about race and belonging, and the treatment of outsiders that followed it, cast a retrospective light on every earlier outsider the institution had struggled to absorb, Princess Michael among them. The categories that had been used to dismiss her, foreign, difficult, not one of us, were themselves coming under scrutiny. She lived long enough to see the ground shift beneath the very assumptions that had condemned her, even if the shift came too late and too partially to rewrite her own place in the story. What endured through all of it was the gap that this whole account keeps returning to, the distance between the public figure and the private one. The public Princess Michael remained, to the end, the sum of her scandals, a name that summoned a headline. The private Princess Michael, the mother of 2 grown children who had turned out steady, the wife of a marriage that had lasted against every prediction, the writer who had quietly produced a shelf of books, went on existing in the places the cameras never reached. Both were real. Neither ever fully displaced the other in the public mind, because the loud version always drowns out the quiet one, and hers was among the loudest reputations the modern monarchy produced. She spent her later years as a woman who had done a great deal, been accused of a great deal, and been understood by almost no one, held in the permanent limbo the institution reserves for the outsider it will neither embrace nor let go. That is the shape her life finally took. Not a rise and a fall, not a redemption and not a downfall, but a long, unresolved suspension, a woman held for decades in the space between belonging and exile, aging inside a family that had made a place for her without ever making her welcome. It is not a satisfying shape, because it does not resolve, but it is the true one, and its refusal to resolve is precisely the point, because the failure to resolve was never hers. It was the institution's, and it was, in a sense, deliberate. Which brings us, at last, to the verdict. So who was she, in the end? The woman they called a nasty piece of work, the woman the palace knew and kept and never quite claimed. 3 figures have moved through this whole story, and a fair verdict has to give each of them its due. There is the villain, the grand and difficult woman of the legend, imperious with staff, insistent on rank, capable of the lapses of judgment that produced New York and the brooch, a person who was, by too many consistent accounts to dismiss, genuinely hard work. There is the scapegoat, the displaced survivor of a destroyed world, who clawed her way into the most closed establishment in the country, and was hounded there less for what she did than for what she was, foreign, Catholic, divorced, self-made, punished for all of it, with an appetite reserved for outsiders, while insiders, who behaved worse, were shielded. And there is the system, the institution that knew everything, and chose, across 40 years, neither to protect her nor to remove her, but to hold her in a useful, deniable limbo, absorbing her scandals and withholding its warmth, treating a human being as a manageable liability on a very long lease. The honest verdict is that all 3 are true, and that the truth of her lives in the friction between them, refusing to settle onto any one. She was difficult, and she was wronged. She was, at times, her own worst enemy, and she was, at times, the victim of an unfairness she had done nothing to deserve. She made real mistakes that were entirely hers, and she was blamed for a great many things that were not. To call her simply a villain is to swallow the tabloid legend whole and ignore the survivor underneath and the double standard all around her. To call her simply a scapegoat is to deny her the agency she plainly possessed and to wave away conduct she was genuinely responsible for. She was neither cartoon, she was a formidable, flawed, intelligent, exhausting, sympathetic, difficult human being, which is to say she was a person, and the tragedy of her public life is that she was almost never allowed to be seen as one. But the deepest verdict, the one this story has been building toward from its first minutes, does not fall on her at all. It falls on the institution that surrounded her, because the most revealing thing about the whole affair was never her behavior. It was the family's response to it. The palace knew, from the beginning and at every stage, exactly what she was and exactly what she generated. And its answer, sustained with remarkable consistency across 4 decades, was to make no answer at all, to keep her close enough to be family and cold enough to be disowned, to let the press and the public do the work of condemning her, while the institution itself simply endured her and said nothing. That was not an accident, and it was not neglect. It was a strategy, the same strategy the monarchy has always used on the outsiders. It cannot fully accept, and will not openly reject. Keep them, use them, and let them take the weight of a disapproval. The institution is too careful ever to voice itself. That strategy tells you something about the machinery of monarchy that is worth carrying away from this story, long after the details of any single scandal have faded. The institution is built on belonging, and it divides the world, silently and absolutely, into those who belong and those who do not. To the insiders, it extends an almost unlimited forgiveness, absorbing tempers and failures and even genuine disgrace, protecting its own until the damage becomes existential, and only then, reluctantly, acting. To the outsiders, it extends something colder and more calculating, a conditional and provisional inclusion, close enough to serve the institution's purposes, and distant enough to be sacrificed to public disapproval whenever that disapproval needs a target. Princess Michael spent her life on the wrong side of that line, and no achievement, no endurance, no length of service ever moved her across it. She was foreign when she arrived, and she was foreign when she was old, and the institution she had married into never once, in 40 years, decided that she was one of them. There is a final image worth holding, because it captures the whole of it. A girl born in the last weeks of a lost war, in a country about to expel everyone of her kind, into a family stripped of everything but its names. A woman who spent her entire life trying to build, on that foundation of loss, a place where she finally belonged. And an institution that took her in, housed her, sat her at its table for 4 decades, and never, in all that time, let her stop being a guest. She reached the palace. She never reached the family. She was inside the walls and outside the circle until the end, held there deliberately, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, because a useful outsider is worth keeping, and a welcome one is worth defending, and they had decided, on the day she arrived, which of those she would be allowed to be. They called her a nasty piece of work. Some of it she earned, and some of it was put on her, and the difference between the two was a distinction the world was never much interested in drawing. But the palace knew the whole of it, the fault and the unfairness alike, and the palace made its choice, over and over, for 40 years. It chose to keep her, and to keep her cold, and that choice, in the end, says less about the woman they judged than about the institution that judged her, and could not, for all its centuries of practice at grace, ever quite bring itself to be kind. Thank you for staying with this story, all the way to the end. If it gave you something to think about, a fuller picture of a woman the headlines never really allowed you to see, then do leave a like and subscribe if you have not already, because these long, careful histories are what this channel is built on. And take a look at the other videos on your screen now, because the royal family is full of people whose real stories are far stranger and far more human than the legends that were handed down about them. Watch one of those next, and I will see you in the next story.